On a warm morning in May of 2012, a man named Nikos stood in his family bakery in the heart of Athens, feeling the heat of the ovens on his face as he carefully boxed up a dozen honey-drenched pastries. He hummed a soft tune, imagining the look on his young daughter's face when he brought home her favorite treats for her recovery party. The shop was filled with the sweet, comforting scent of cinnamon and yeast, a small sanctuary of peace in a city that felt like it was slowly falling apart. Nikos had just finished tying a bright blue ribbon around the box when the bells above the door jingled, but it was not the usual cheerful sound of a neighbor coming in for their daily loaf. A tall figure stepped inside, wearing a dark hoodie and a plastic distorted mask from the movie Scream, its frozen white face a jagged contrast to the warm golden light of the bakery. In one hand, the stranger held a heavy black handgun that trembled violently, and in the other, he held a small, empty canvas bag. Instead of a barked command or a threat, the voice that came from behind the mask was soft, refined, and deeply apologetic, whispering a plea for forgiveness even as the barrel of the gun pointed directly at the baker's chest. It was a moment where the ordinary world shattered, leaving behind a cold silence that would haunt that little shop for years. Today, I am going to tell you 13 stories with the theme of the year 2012, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath. But before we get into the details, if you are a fan of weird, dark, and mysterious things told in story form, please gently tap the like button like you are handing over a fresh loaf of warm bread to a neighbor in need. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode of these true accounts. Okay, now let's get to today's stories. We begin our journey in the ancient streets of Greece, where the weight of a nation's collapse forced a good man to do something unthinkable. The man behind that plastic mask was named Georgios, and just a few years earlier, he was the kind of person everyone in his neighborhood looked up to with a sense of genuine respect. He was a high-ranking manager at one of the largest banks in Athens, a man who wore perfectly tailored wool suits and carried a leather briefcase that always smelled of expensive cedar and old money. Georgios was known for his quiet dignity, his sharp intellect, and the way he moved through the world with purpose. Every single evening after finishing his long shifts at the bank, Georgios would walk to a small park near his home, carrying a small bag of high-quality kibble to feed the neighborhood's stray cats. He would sit on a weathered stone bench, speaking softly to the animals as if they were his oldest friends, showing a level of tenderness that most people in the high-stakes world of finance never bothered to cultivate. It was a small, daily ritual that defined his character more than his title ever could. Georgios lived in a beautiful apartment filled with sunlight and the sound of his daughter, Eleni, playing the piano in the afternoons while the Mediterranean breeze drifted through the open windows. His greatest dream, the one he whispered to his wife every night, was that someday they would travel across the ocean so Eleni could study music at the finest conservatory in London. He had spent over 20 years carefully building a wall of financial security to ensure that her future was perfectly paved. On his dresser, next to his watch and his wedding ring, sat a small, silver medical charm known as a panagia, a traditional Greek token of protection that had been passed down through his family for generations. He touched the cool metal every morning before leaving for work, a silent prayer for the safety and health of those he loved most in the world. To Georgios, that little silver disc represented the permanence of his family's luck and the stability of the life he had worked so hard to create. Then, the global financial crisis of 2008 reached the shores of Greece like a slow-moving tidal wave that eventually pulled the entire foundation of the middle class out to sea. By early 2012, the bank where Georgios had spent his entire adult life suddenly shuttered its doors, and he found himself standing on the sidewalk with nothing but a cardboard box. His pension vanished overnight, his savings were frozen, and the tailored suits began to fray at the cuffs. The tragedy deepened when Eleni was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive medical condition that required a specialized surgery only available at a private clinic with an astronomical price tag. Georgios spent his days going from one government office to another, begging for the insurance coverage he had paid into for decades, only to be met with cold stares and stacks of paperwork. The man who once managed millions of euros now found himself unable to buy a single bottle of his daughter's medicine. He began to sell everything he owned, from the piano to the family heirlooms, but the pile of medical bills continued to grow like a mountain of debt that threatened to crush the life out of his child. Georgios watched his daughter grow paler each day, her once bright eyes turning glassy and tired as the window for her surgery began to close. The desperation he felt was not a sudden burst of heat, but a cold, heavy weight in his chest that slowly replaced his sense of morality and logic. The day he decided to become the man in the mask, the air in Athens was thick with the smell of exhaust and the sound of distant protests echoing through the concrete canyons of the city streets. Georgios stood in his empty living room, looking at the silver Panagia charm on the dusty dresser, feeling a profound sense of failure that no words could ever describe. He realized that the world he believed in had abandoned him, and if he wanted his daughter to live, he would have to become a ghost. Inside the small, quiet bakery, the world seemed to slow down to a crawl as the scent of fresh bread mixed with the sharp, metallic odor of the robber's gun and his own cold, terrified sweat. The golden morning light filtered through the flour-dusted windows, casting long shadows across the tiled floor where Nikos, the baker, stood paralyzed with fear. There was no sound except for the ticking of an old wooden clock on the wall and the heavy, ragged breathing of the man behind the mask. Georgios felt the cold plastic of the scream mask pressing against his skin, his eyes darting around the small shop as he tried to maintain his grip on the weapon that felt heavier than a lead weight. He noticed the blue ribbon on the pastry box and felt a sharp, agonizing stab of recognition, thinking of the many times he had bought similar treats for Eleni. His mind raced with justifications, telling himself that he was not a criminal, but a soldier fighting a war for the survival of his own blood. The wrong note was a subtle change in the rhythm of the neighborhood, a slight dimming of the light as a cloud passed over the sun, and the way the street outside suddenly went unnaturally quiet. Georgios noticed a small, silver glint on the counter near the register, a discarded coin that looked just like his family's protective charm, and for a split second, he felt a wave of nausea. He realized that the man standing across from him was not an enemy, but another father just trying to provide. Now, the scene is happening in a blur of motion. Your heart hammers against your ribs like a trapped bird. Cold metal touches your temple, and you can feel the jagged edges of the gunman's shaking hands. The white plastic face of the mask stares back at you with a frozen, mocking grin that seems to grow larger in the dim light. You can hear the blood rushing in your ears, a deafening roar that drowns out the sound of the baker's soft sobs and the distant sirens. You are standing behind the wooden counter, and your hands are completely covered in white flour, making them look like the hands of a ghost in the shadows of the shop. In this moment, you have to decide, do you reach for the silent alarm button hidden under the ledge, or do you reach out for the man's trembling hand? You can see the desperation in his eyes through the small holes of the mask, a look of pure, unadulterated agony that tells you he is more afraid than you are. The investigation into the Scream Mask robberies would eventually reveal a pattern that baffled the local police, who were used to dealing with hardened criminals and violent street gangs. Every witness described the same tall man who never used profanity, never raised his voice, and always ended the robbery by saying he was sorry for the trouble. He only targeted small businesses, taking just enough to cover the next installment of a massive hospital bill that the state refused to acknowledge. When the police finally caught Georgios in late 2012, they found him sitting on a park bench, feeding the stray cats just as he had done for 20 years. In his pocket, they found the silver Panagia charm, the anchor of his former life, sitting right next to a stack of stolen euros that were damp with his own tears. The irony was silent but devastating. The object meant to protect his family had watched him lose his soul in a desperate bid to save his daughter's physical heart. Georgios was taken into custody without a struggle, his head bowed in a posture of total defeat as the handcuffs clicked shut around his thin, weathered wrists in the fading light. The news of his arrest spread through Athens like wildfire, sparking a fierce debate among a population that was already on the edge of a total social collapse. Many people saw him as a common criminal who deserved a long sentence, while others saw him as a tragic symbol of a system that had failed its citizens. The court proceedings were somber and quiet, filled with the testimonies of business owners like Nikos, who spoke of the robber's politeness and the deep sadness that seemed to radiate from him. Georgios sat in the defendant's chair, never once looking up, his face lined with the stress of 1,000 sleepless nights and the weight of a shame that would never fade. He was eventually sentenced to several years in prison, far away from the daughter he had tried so desperately to save. This is a story about the fragile nature of our social contracts and the terrifying speed at which a good person can be pushed to the very edge of the abyss by forces they cannot control. Georgios was not a man who loved violence or greed, but a man who loved his daughter more than his own dignity or his own freedom. In a world that had forgotten how to be kind, his fall was a mirror held up to a society in ruin, showing the jagged edges of what remains when the money runs out. The legacy of the man in the mask remains a haunting part of the history of Athens during that dark year, a reminder that the line between a respected citizen and a desperate criminal is thin. People still talk about the bank manager who traded his suits for a plastic mask, wondering if they would have made the same choice if their child's life was on the line. It serves as a warm tribute to the power of a father's love, even when that love is expressed through a broken and illegal path. In 2026, modern forensic psychologists use the case of Georgios as a primary example of survival psychology within a collapsed economy, a field that has grown significantly. Researchers now look at the neurological impact of long-term financial stress, which can literally rewire the brain's moral centers when the survival of a dependent is at risk. Today's digital tracking of medical debts allows for a much faster identification of these specific types of desperate crimes. While one man used a mask to hide his desperation in the sun-drenched streets of Athens, another man in the English countryside used silence to hide a deadly secret within his own home. He thought that by following a strict routine, he could outrun the shadow of a past that was slowly catching up to him on a leafy trail. November 10th, 2012, Weybridge, United Kingdom. The morning air in the Surrey countryside was exceptionally crisp and held the scent of damp pine needles and the cold, metallic tang of an approaching winter. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of frosted leaves underfoot and the distant, lonely call of a single crow perched on a gnarled oak tree. A thin layer of mist clung to the manicured lawns of the luxury estates, hiding the edges of the world. Alexander Parapolichnai, a 44-year-old man with a face that seemed perpetually etched with a quiet intensity, stepped out of his front door and took a deep, bracing breath. He adjusted his expensive running jacket, the fabric rustling softly against his skin, and began to stretch his legs with the practiced ease of a man who found comfort in discipline. He was a man who moved through life with a calculated grace, always aware of the space he occupied in every room. He had spent the last few years living in a magnificent estate within a gated community, a place where the gates were tall and the security cameras were always blinking with a steady, red light. To his neighbors, Alexander was a wealthy businessman who enjoyed the finer things in life, but to those who knew his true history, he was a man walking a very narrow tightrope. He had moved his family from Russia to the safety of the English woods to escape a shadow. Every morning, Alexander followed a routine that was as predictable as the rising sun, a series of small actions that gave him a sense of control in an unpredictable world. He would wake up early, spend a few moments looking out at the foggy garden, and then head to the kitchen to prepare for his daily jog. He believed that as long as he maintained his health and his awareness, he could keep the ghosts of his past from catching up to his new, peaceful life. In the kitchen, his wife Tatiana would usually be stirring a pot of tea, the steam rising in white curls that smelled of bergamot and honey. They rarely spoke about the dangers that had followed them across the continent, choosing instead to focus on the mundane details of their children's school schedules or the upcoming holiday plans. It was a fragile peace, built on the shared silence of two people who knew exactly how much they had to lose if the world outside found them. Alexander reached for his favorite water bottle, a high-end, blue-tinted designer container that he had purchased specifically for its durable build and its ability to keep water ice cold. He filled it to the brim, the sound of the running tap echoing in the quiet kitchen, and tightened the cap until he felt the satisfying click of the seal. This bottle was his constant companion on his runs, a small object of comfort that he carried like a talisman against the heat of exertion. He was a man who took great pride in his physical fitness, often bragging to his friends about how his heart rate remained steady even during the most grueling sprints up the Surrey hills. He viewed his body as a fortress, one that he reinforced every single day with clean eating and rigorous exercise. His dream was that someday he would be able to stop looking over his shoulder and finally enjoy the wealth he had accumulated without the constant fear of a knock at the door. Tatiana watched him from the breakfast table, admiring the way the morning light caught the gray in his hair and the strength in his shoulders as he prepared to leave. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had built in Weybridge, a place where the air felt cleaner and the threats felt like they were 1,000 miles away. She believed that the tall hedges and the private security patrols were enough to keep her family safe from the reach of the old world. Alexander stepped out onto the gravel driveway, the small stones crunching under his running shoes with a sound that reminded him of breaking glass. He took one last look at his home, the grand brick facade standing tall against the gray sky, and felt a surge of pride. He adjusted the strap of his water bottle and began a slow, steady trot toward the trail that led into the deeper woods, his breath blooming in the cold air like small, ephemeral ghosts that vanished. As he moved further away from the estate, the sounds of the modern world began to fade, replaced by the whispering of the wind through the bare branches and the soft thud of his own heart. He loved this part of the day, when he was alone with his thoughts and the physical sensation of his muscles working in perfect harmony. He felt invincible in the silence of the English countryside, far removed from the complex financial schemes and the dangerous men he had left behind. The trail wound through a dense thicket of trees where the light was dim and the shadows were long, creating a sense of isolation that Alexander usually found refreshing rather than frightening. He took a long pull from his water bottle, the cool liquid sliding down his throat and providing a momentary burst of energy. He didn't notice the way the water seemed to have a faint, almost imperceptible herbal aftertaste, like the scent of a crushed flower hidden in the grass. He continued his pace, his legs moving with a mechanical precision that spoke of years of training and a mind that refused to accept fatigue. He thought about the documents he had recently handed over to the prosecutors, the long lists of names and numbers that exposed a massive money laundering scheme. He felt a sense of justice in his actions, believing that by speaking the truth, he was finally purging himself of the darkness that had once surrounded his career in Moscow. The peace of the morning was absolute, a perfect symphony of natural sounds and the steady, comforting rhythm of his own breathing. The sun began to break through the clouds, casting long, golden fingers of light across the forest floor and making the frost on the leaves sparkle like a field of diamonds. Alexander felt a deep sense of contentment, a rare moment where the anxiety that usually hummed in the back of his mind was completely and utterly silenced by the beauty. But then, he noticed a very small, strange sensation in the back of his throat, a slight tingling that felt like a tiny needle was pressing against his skin. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the feeling, and took another sip of his water, but the tingling only seemed to grow more intense. He slowed his pace slightly, wondering if he was coming down with a cold or if the dry morning air was simply irritating his lungs more than usual after the long night. He dismissed the feeling with a shake of his head, telling himself that a man as healthy as he was shouldn't be worrying about a minor itch in his throat. He pushed his body harder, forcing himself to run faster to prove that he was still in total control of his physical form. But the tingling was followed by a sudden heavy warmth that began to spread from his chest into his arms, a sensation that felt like his blood was slowly turning into thick, heated lead. Now, the world is beginning to change. Your lungs suddenly seize up, refusing to take in the air that you so desperately need, and your heart begins to flutter like a panicked bird trapped in a cage. You feel a wave of intense nausea wash over you, and the ground beneath your feet begins to tilt and spin as if you are standing on the deck of a ship in a storm. The bright golden light of the morning turns into a series of jagged black streaks that dance before your eyes. You are watching from the tall glass window of the kitchen, your hand still holding the warm ceramic mug of tea, as you see your husband's figure emerge from the trees at the edge of the driveway. He isn't running with his usual grace. Instead, he is stumbling, his body jerking in strange, unnatural ways. You see him reach out toward the air as if trying to grab onto something invisible, and then he collapses onto the cold gravel, his blue water bottle rolling away. You are Tatiana, and in this heartbeat, you are frozen by a choice that feels like it will define the rest of your life. Do you drop your cup and run out to him, potentially exposing yourself to whatever has just struck him down, or do you stay inside and call for the ambulance? You can see his chest heaving as he struggles for breath, and for a terrifying second, you realize that the safety you thought you had bought with your silence was nothing more than an illusion. The initial medical report from the scene suggested that Alexander had suffered a sudden and massive heart attack, brought on by the physical exertion of his run and perhaps an undiagnosed cardiac condition. To the local police, it seemed like a tragic but straightforward case of a healthy man being struck down in the prime of his life. They saw no signs of a struggle, no wounds on his body, and no reason to suspect that anything other than nature had taken its course. However, when the investigators looked closer at the blue-tinted water bottle that had rolled into the grass, they found something that didn't belong in a health-conscious runner's drink. Years later, after persistent pressure from his family and the authorities, a second autopsy was performed using much more advanced techniques. They discovered traces of a rare and lethal plant toxin known as Gelsemium elegans, also called Heartbreak grass, which had been hidden in his system. The plant is native to the remote mountains of Asia and is known to be a signature tool for contract killers who want their work to look like a natural death. The toxin works by paralyzing the respiratory system and causing the heart to stop, leaving behind very few clues for a standard coroner to find. The anchor of Alexander's morning routine, the water bottle that was supposed to sustain his life, had been the very vessel that delivered the invisible weapon to his lips. The aftermath of the discovery sent shockwaves through the diplomatic and intelligence communities, as it became clear that Alexander had been the target of a high-profile assassination on British soil. The gated community and the tall hedges had not been enough to protect him from a killer who knew his every move and his every habit. His death was not an accident of biology, but a calculated strike designed to silence a man who knew too much about the wrong people. The case remains a haunting reminder of the lengths to which certain organizations will go to protect their secrets, even in the heart of a peaceful English suburb. Alexander died believing he was finally safe, running toward a future that had already been stolen from him by a drop of poison hidden in a bottle of water. The image of him collapsing on his own driveway, just feet away from the sanctuary of his home, continues to linger in the minds of those he left behind. His story is a fade into the gray mist of international intrigue, where the truth is often buried under layers of plausible deniability and the passage of time. Alexander was a man who tried to rewrite his ending, but he found that the past is a shadow that doesn't care about distance or the strength of a man's heart. He remains a symbol of the high price of whistleblowing and the terrifying reality that nowhere is truly safe when you are being hunted by a ghost. Fast forward 14 years to the present day, forensic biology has reached a point where we can now perform what is called botanical signature mapping. This technology allows toxicologists to analyze the specific chemical isotopes within a plant toxin to determine exactly which region of the world it was grown in. This means that today, a killer using a rare poison like Heartbreak grass would leave a digital and biological trail that leads directly back to the source of the assassination order. From a poison hidden in a plant to a hunger hidden in a ritual, the nature of what we fear is constantly changing. While a man in England was silenced by a silent toxin, a young woman in the heart of Brazil was about to discover that some neighbors carry a darkness that is far more ancient and visceral than anything found in a laboratory. April 11th, 2012. Garanhuns, Brazil. The morning sun was already heavy and humid, casting long, wavering shadows across the dusty cobblestone streets of the small town in Pernambuco. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of a wooden cart and the occasional chirp of a tropical bird hidden deep within the lush green foliage of the nearby hills. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of overripe mangoes. The light had a strange golden hue that seemed to coat everything in a layer of honey, making the peeling paint on the old colonial buildings look beautiful rather than decaying. A slight breeze carried the salty tang of the distant ocean, though the sea was many miles away, mixing with the aroma of strong coffee brewing in a dozen different kitchens. It was a sensory world that felt timeless and entirely safe, a place where everyone knew their neighbor's name. A young woman named Bruna, only 20 years old and possessing a smile that seemed to brighten even the dimmest corners of the neighborhood, walked quickly toward a small white house with a bright blue door. She was dressed in her best floral skirt, her heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy as she prepared for a job interview. Bruna was the kind of person who always stopped to help an elderly neighbor carry their heavy groceries. She had spent most of her life in this quiet town, but her mind was always drifting toward the distant lights of the big city, where she hoped to one day study at the university and become a teacher. Bruna believed that education was the key to a better life for her family, and she had saved every single cent from her previous jobs to make that dream a reality. This new position as a nanny for a local couple seemed like the perfect stepping stone to her future. As she walked down the main street, she waved to the local baker, who was just pulling a tray of fresh rolls out of the oven, the steam rising in thick white clouds that smelled of yeast and warmth. She felt a deep sense of belonging in this community, believing that the people around her were a protective shield against the dangers of the outside world. To Bruna, Garenhunds was more than just a place to live. It was a sanctuary where everyone was looked after. Her mother had always told her that she had a heart that was too big for such a small town, and that one day she would find a way to share her light with more people than she could count. Bruna carried those words with her like a precious treasure, using them to fuel her ambition during the long, hot days of manual labor she had endured to save her money. She was determined to prove that a girl from Pernambuco could achieve anything she set her mind to doing. In her small canvas bag, tucked away next to her identification papers, was a small, handwritten recipe for traditional meat pies, known locally as empadas. It was a family secret passed down from her grandmother, and she intended to offer to bake a batch for her new employers as a way of showing her gratitude and her domestic skills. To Bruna, that piece of paper was a symbol of her heritage and the simple, honest love she wanted to bring into the household. When she finally reached the small white house with the bright blue door, she took a deep, steadying breath and smoothed down her skirt one last time. The house was surrounded by a neatly trimmed hedge of hibiscus flowers, their vibrant red petals standing out against the white walls like splashes of fresh paint in the midday sun. It looked exactly like the kind of place a young woman could start a new chapter of her life with a sense of security and purpose. The door was opened by a middle-aged woman named Isabel, whose face was framed by soft gray hair and who wore a clean, white apron over a simple dress. She greeted Bruna with a warm, welcoming smile that reached all the way to her tired eyes, making the young woman feel instantly at home. Isabel's voice was gentle and low, like the sound of a distant stream, as she invited Bruna inside to meet her husband and discuss the details of the nanny position. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the mouth-watering scent of savory meat and spices drifting from the kitchen, a smell that reminded Bruna of Sunday afternoons with her own family. The floors were made of dark, polished wood that gleamed in the soft light filtering through the lace curtains, and the furniture was arranged in a way that suggested a life of quiet, domestic bliss. It was a scene of absolute peace that felt like a warm embrace to the girl. Isabel's husband, Jorge, was sitting in a large armchair in the corner of the living room, a thick book resting in his lap, and a pair of spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked like a man of great wisdom and calm, his movements slow and deliberate as he stood up to shake Bruna's hand with a firm, steady grip. He spoke about the importance of family and the need to protect the innocent from the corrupting influences of the modern, outside world. As the interview began, Bruna found herself relaxing into the conversation, sharing her dreams of becoming a teacher and her love for working with children of all ages. The couple listened with rapt attention, nodding their heads in agreement and offering words of encouragement that made her feel truly seen and appreciated. They told her that they were looking for a woman with a pure heart and a strong spirit, someone who understood the value of sacrifice. The sounds of the neighborhood continued outside, the occasional bark of a dog or the chime of a church bell marking the passage of time in the quiet afternoon. Inside the house, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the soft clinking of teacups as Isabel served a small refreshment. It was an environment that seemed to radiate safety, a place where the chaos of the world could never hope to reach or disturb anyone. Isabel brought out a small plate of warm empadas, the crust golden and flaky, and offered one to Bruna with a kind look that seemed to promise a bright future within their home. Bruna took a bite, the flavor rich and familiar, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity that was unfolding before her. She imagined herself spending many happy years in this house, helping to raise the couple's child and becoming a member of their tight-knit family. However, as Isabel went back to the kitchen to fetch more tea, Bruna's eyes drifted toward a thick, leather-bound notebook sitting open on a small side table just a few feet away. It was filled with 50 pages of dense, cramped handwriting that seemed to crawl across the paper like a swarm of insects, and strange, jagged illustrations that made her stomach turn. The title on the front cover, written in dark, bold ink, read, "Revelations of a Schizophrenic." Bruna felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up her spine, even though the room was quite warm from the heat of the nearby kitchen and the afternoon sun. She tried to rationalize the notebook as perhaps a research project or a creative writing exercise, but the images of eyes and geometric shapes felt deeply wrong in such a normal, peaceful setting. She looked back at Jorge, who was watching her with a blank, unblinking expression that made her feel very exposed. The air in the room suddenly felt very heavy and hard to breathe, as if the oxygen was being slowly sucked out of the space by an invisible force. Bruna noticed that Jorge's hands were gripped tightly onto the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white as he leaned forward slightly toward her. The warm, savory scent of the meat pies began to change, taking on a metallic, bitter edge that made her feel a sudden and overwhelming sense of intense nausea. Now, the entire world is beginning to move in slow motion, as if you are watching a scene unfold through a thick layer of dark, murky water. You hear the sharp, loud click of the front door being locked from the outside, followed by the heavy sliding of a wooden bolt that echoes through the house. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock suddenly sounds like the beating of a drum, faster and faster, until it fills your entire head with a deafening noise. You feel a cold, hard pressure against the back of your neck, and your muscles suddenly turn to lead, refusing to follow the desperate commands of your brain to run. The floor beneath your feet seems to tilt and sway, and the bright sunlight filtering through the curtains turns into a series of jagged black streaks that dance before your eyes. You try to scream for help, but your throat is tight and dry, and only a soft, raspy whisper manages to escape your lips. You are a neighbor living just 2 houses down from the small white house with the bright blue door, and you are currently sitting at your own kitchen table. You are taking a large, satisfied bite of a warm meat pie you bought this morning from the nice couple who lives down the street. It is the most delicious thing you have ever tasted, with a rich filling that seems to melt on your tongue. Do you finish your meal, or do you listen to the faint scratching? The investigation into the activities of Jorge and Isabel would eventually uncover the existence of a dark and twisted cult known simply as the Cartel. They believed that they were chosen by a higher power to reduce the world's population by eliminating those they deemed to be impure. From a criminological standpoint, the most dangerous offenders are often those who feel a moral obligation to commit their crimes, as they lack the internal restraints of guilt. In the back of the house, hidden behind a false wall in the laundry room, the police found a deep pit where the remains of several missing women had been carefully buried. The trio had been luring young women to the house with promises of work, only to murder them in ritualistic ceremonies they believed would cleanse the world of sin. The horror of the case was compounded when it was revealed that they had been using the flesh of their victims to make pies. The illustrated diary, titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic, contained over 50 pages of detailed instructions on how to select, capture, and process a human being. It was written by Jorge, who believed he was receiving direct orders from a divine entity that demanded blood in exchange for the salvation of the human race. The madness of the trio was so absolute that they even fed the remains of their victims to a child they were raising in the household. When the police finally raided the home in late April of 2012, they found the trio sitting at the dining table, looking as calm and peaceful as any other family. They did not resist arrest, believing that their mission was righteous and that the world would eventually understand the necessity of their actions. The discovery of the bodies beneath the floorboards sent shockwaves through the community, turning the peaceful town into a nightmare. The townspeople of Garenhuns were left with a trauma that would take decades to heal, as they realized they had unknowingly participated in the most horrific of crimes. Many residents could no longer eat the traditional empadas they once loved, the memory of the savory meat now forever tainted by the knowledge of where it had actually come from. The small white house with the blue door was eventually boarded up, standing as a silent monument to the victims. Jorge and the 2 women were eventually sentenced to many years in high-security prison, where they remained unrepentant for their actions and the lives they had destroyed. They continued to speak of their mission and the need for purification, even as the walls of their cells closed in around them. The case became a landmark in Brazilian criminal history, serving as a terrifying reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a mask of religious devotion. The diary that no one bothered to read until it was far too late remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever collected in a murder investigation. It is a dark irony that the very act of nourishment, which is supposed to sustain life and bring people together, was turned into a weapon of absolute destruction against the innocent. Bruna's light was extinguished by a group of people who believed that the only way to save the world was to kill it. Now, well over a decade later, psychological experts use the Garenhuns case to study a phenomenon known as folie à trois, where a shared delusional disorder affects three people. Modern analysis focuses on how isolated environments can act as incubators for these dangerous beliefs, allowing a leader to manipulate others into committing acts of extreme violence. Today's digital monitoring of extremist literature helps to identify these small cults early. Trusting a neighbor can lead you to a warm dinner table, but trusting the silence of the deep woods can lead you into the crosshairs of a hunter who has already decided your fate. While a young woman in Brazil was trapped within a house, a truck driver in the vast Russian wilderness was about to find out that the forest itself had eyes, and they were all focused directly on the back of his neck as he drove down a long and lonely highway in the middle of summer. June 14th, 2012, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Izhevsk, Russia. The air was thick with the heavy scent of pine needles baking in the summer sun, a sharp and resinous smell that seemed to stick to the back of the throat. High above, the only sound was the rhythmic, metallic clicking of a grasshopper hidden in the tall weeds by the roadside, accompanied by the low, constant rustle of birch leaves. The light was a blinding, pale yellow that shimmered off the black asphalt. Emerging from the shimmering heat of the long road was a massive, dust-covered semi-truck driven by a man named Mikhail. At 45 years old, Mikhail possessed a laugh that could be heard over the roar of a diesel engine, a sound that usually signaled the start of a long-winded joke over the radio. He was currently gripping the steering wheel with thick, calloused hands, his eyes squinting against the glare as he navigated the endless stretch of Siberian forest that lined the path. Mikhail had spent more than 25 years behind the wheel of a heavy rig, and he viewed the vast network of Russian highways as his true home. He grew up in a tiny village where the winters lasted for 8 months, and he often told his wife that the only way to stay warm was to keep moving. He was a man of immense physical strength but even greater patience, a quality that made him a legend among the younger drivers who often grew frustrated with the slow pace of the freight lines. Inside the cabin of his truck, Mikhail had created a world that was entirely his own, a small sanctuary filled with the things that grounded him during his weeks away from his family. He kept a small, portable stove for making strong black tea, the steam rising in the small space and smelling of charred leaves and home. He had a photograph of his daughter in her graduation gown taped to the dashboard, her bright smile a constant reminder of why he spent so many lonely nights on the road. His greatest dream, the one he discussed with his fellow drivers over a shared thermos of tea at the rest stops, was that someday he would finally hang up his keys. He wanted to buy a small orchard in the south where the soil was rich and the winters were mild, a place where he could grow apples and watch his grandchildren play in the grass. He viewed every mile he traveled as a small payment toward that future, a steady investment in a life of quiet peace that he felt he had earned. Mikhail was a man who understood the specific security illusion of the highway, the belief that as long as you stayed within the painted lines of the asphalt, you were safe from the wildness of the world. He felt that the heavy steel of his truck was a suit of armor, a barrier that protected him from the elements and any potential threats lurking in the shadows. To him, the road was a predictable and controlled corridor that existed separately from the dense, untamed woods surrounding it. On his dashboard, right next to the photograph of his daughter, sat a small, spring-mounted dog bobblehead that he had picked up at a gas station in Moscow many years ago. The little dog had a painted-on grin and eyes that seemed to twinkle as its head nodded in time with the vibrations of the massive engine. Mikhail had a habit of tapping the dog's head whenever he hit a particularly smooth stretch of road, a tiny gesture of satisfaction that the journey was going exactly according to plan. The bobblehead had become a sort of silent partner for Mikhail, a lucky charm that had seen him through blinding blizzards and torrential autumn rains without a single accident. He often joked that the dog knew the route better than he did, and its constant, cheerful nodding was a sign that the road ahead was clear of any obstacles. It was a harmless plastic toy, but in the isolation of the long-haul life, It provided a sense of companionship that was both simple and profoundly grounding. He took a long sip of his lukewarm tea, the liquid sliding down his throat and providing a momentary distraction from the monotonous hum of the tires against the road. The truck felt heavy and stable beneath him, a powerful machine that responded to his every touch with a deep, guttural roar of approval. Mikhail felt a sense of total mastery over his environment, a feeling of absolute confidence that today was just another routine delivery in a career that had been defined by reliability. The forest on either side of the highway was a wall of deep green, a tangled mass of branches and shadows that seemed to swallow the light of the afternoon sun. Mikhail didn't pay much attention to the trees, viewing them as a beautiful but distant backdrop to his primary mission of reaching the next checkpoint before nightfall. He assumed that the only things living in those woods were the deer and the bears that occasionally wandered onto the shoulder of the road looking for salt. His cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of old upholstery and the faint, sweet scent of a vanilla air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The sun beat down on the windshield, creating a pocket of warmth that made him feel slightly drowsy, a familiar sensation that he combated by turning up the volume on his radio. An upbeat folk song began to play, and he found himself humming along, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat against the leather of the steering wheel. Mikhail looked out at the horizon, where the road seemed to stretch on forever into the blue haze of the distance, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude for his life. He was a man who had worked hard, loved his family, and found a way to thrive in a demanding profession that broke many lesser men. He felt that the world was a fundamentally fair place, and that his dedication to his craft would eventually be rewarded with the quiet retirement he so often imagined. The vibration of the truck was a steady, low-frequency thrum that he felt in the soles of his boots and the small of his back, a sensation that was as familiar as his own heartbeat. The road was empty of other vehicles, giving him the rare luxury of the entire lane to himself as he eased the heavy rig around a gentle curve. The little bobblehead dog on the dashboard continued its frantic, happy nodding, its plastic eyes fixed on the path ahead, as if it could see something he could not. The air inside the cabin was still and quiet, save for the music and the engine, creating an atmosphere of profound safety and isolation from the external world. Mikhail adjusted his side mirror, watching the dust kick up behind his wheels in a long, swirling cloud that eventually vanished into the green wall of the trees. He felt like a king in his high seat, looking down upon the world from a position of strength and security that few other people ever got the chance to experience. But then, as he rounded a particularly sharp bend, where the trees grew right up to the edge of the gravel shoulder, he noticed something strange in the corner of his eye. It was a very small silver glint that seemed to flash from deep within the dense shadows of the birch grove, a tiny spark of light that didn't belong in the natural world. He squinted, wondering if it was a piece of discarded trash or perhaps a reflective sign that had been knocked over by the wind. He dismissed the flash with a quick shake of his head, telling himself that the heat of the afternoon was starting to play tricks on his vision and that he needed to stop at the next station for a fresh coffee. He focused back on the road, but the image of that sharp, cold glint remained burned into his mind like a hot coal. It was a detail that felt out of sync with the peaceful summer afternoon, a jagged edge in an otherwise perfectly smooth and predictable landscape. He reached out to tap the head of the bobblehead dog, seeking that small, familiar comfort, but his hand stopped midair as a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the cabin. It wasn't the sound of the engine or the radio, but a high-pitched, metallic crack that sounded like a heavy branch snapping under the weight of a winter storm. In the same heartbeat, the air in the cabin was suddenly filled with the smell of ozone and the sharp, stinging scent of shattered safety glass. Now, everything is happening in a terrifying blur of motion. You hear the deafening shatter of your side window as it turns into 1,000 tiny diamonds of light. You feel a sudden, searing heat in your neck that feels like a branding iron has been pressed against your skin, followed by a cold, wet sensation that begins to soak into the collar of your shirt. You cannot see the road anymore. Instead, you see only the swirling green of the trees as the steering wheel slips. You are lying in a shallow, perfectly camouflaged dugout carved into the damp earth of the forest floor, and you are holding your breath with a level of discipline that was forged in the heat of international competition. Your finger is resting against the cold, smooth curve of a high-caliber trigger, and your eye is pressed firmly against the rubber seal of a professional scope. You see a man through the glass of a truck, and he is tapping the head of a small plastic toy. You are the sniper, a man who once stood on the podium as a hero of the state, but whose mind has now become a fractured map of a war that no one else is fighting. In this moment, do you pull back from the lens and realize that the man in the cabin is not an enemy soldier, or do you let the recoil of the rifle push you back into the dirt? You have spent weeks living in the shadows like a ghost, and the only thing that makes you feel alive is the sudden, violent impact. The investigation into the series of highway shootings that had terrorized the region of Udmurtia for 3 long months would eventually lead to a discovery that shocked the entire nation. Forensic teams spent weeks combing the dense forests, looking for any sign of a human presence, but the shooter had been a master of evasion and camouflage. It was only after a massive manhunt involving hundreds of special forces that a small, hidden bunker was found beneath the roots of an old oak. Inside the dugout, the police found a meticulously organized living space, complete with professional military equipment, a high-caliber hunting rifle, and a collection of maps marked with the exact locations of every shooting. The perpetrator was a former biathlete who had suffered a severe mental breakdown after his career ended, and he had decided to use his elite training to go to war with society. He had lived in the woods for months, surviving on stolen food and pure, icy focus. The anchor of Mikhail's long and peaceful career, the small dog bobblehead that had sat on his dashboard for over a decade, was found in the wreckage of his truck. The plastic head had been shattered by the force of the impact, its painted-on grin replaced by a jagged hole that revealed the rusted spring inside. It was a silent witness to the moment that the security illusion of the highway was finally and irrevocably destroyed by a man hiding in the green shadows of the trees. Mikhail was one of the few victims who survived the initial burst of gunfire, but the physical and psychological wounds he sustained would ensure that he never sat behind the wheel of a truck again. His dream of a quiet orchard in the south was replaced by a long and painful recovery in a sterile hospital ward, where the only sound was the beeping of a heart monitor. The man who had once been a king of the road now found himself afraid of the very sight of a forest. The sniper was eventually cornered in his bunker after a tense standoff that lasted for several hours, with the special forces using infrared cameras to track his movements through the earth. He was taken into custody without a single word, his eyes blank and staring as if he was still looking through the scope of his rifle at a distant target. He didn't seem to recognize the men who were arresting him, or the magnitude of the terror he had inflicted on so many innocent people. In a landmark legal ruling, the former biathlete was declared legally insane and unfit to stand trial for the murders and the countless lives he had shattered during his summer of violence. He was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility, a place where the walls were thick and the windows were barred, far away from the forests and the highways he had once dominated. He would spend the rest of his life in a world of white halls and medicated silence, a ghost of a man. The case remains a haunting example of how elite training and a fractured mind can combine to create a predator that is almost impossible to detect until it is far too late. It serves as a reminder that the lines we draw for our own safety, the paved roads and the locked doors, are often much thinner than we like to believe. The woods around Izevsk remain beautiful and green, but for those who remember the summer of 2012, they will always hold a shadow. The story of the biathlete who became a demon is a grim testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world are the ones we once cheered for in the bright lights of the stadium. It is a legal ending that provides no real closure for the victims, leaving behind only a sense of profound and lingering unease. Mikhail's laughter was silenced, not by a natural disaster or a mechanical failure, but by the cold, calculated precision of a human being. In our current technological landscape, authorities in high-risk regions now use LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to map the forest floor with incredible accuracy even through dense canopy. This allows police to identify unnatural depressions in the earth or camouflage structures that would be invisible to the naked eye or traditional cameras. Today, a sniper trying to build a hidden dugout would be spotted from the air within hours, long before they could ever fire a single shot. From a single sniper hidden in a massive forest to a lone killer operating within the quiet, mummified walls of a city apartment, the scale of horror is often found in the smallest details. While a man in Russia was hunted by special forces across the wilderness, a woman in the heart of France had been missing for 18 years, only to be found in a place that her husband had touched every single day while he sat in his favorite chair. February 11th, 2012, Lyon, France. The morning began with a thick, gray winter fog that seemed to swallow the narrow cobblestone streets of the ancient Croix-Rousse district whole. The world outside was a muffled landscape of wet stone and the distant, lonely chime of a church bell echoing through the heavy air. Inside the belly of an old apartment building, the atmosphere was bone-chillingly cold and filled with the scent of damp earth. The only sound in the deep basement was the rhythmic, hollow echoing of a mason's hammer striking against a damp brick wall, a sound that felt out of place in the silent, underground storage room. Each blow sent a small vibration through the floor, a tiny tremor that seemed to disturb the very foundation of the building. The air was thick with a suffocating scent of dry rot and stagnant dust that had not been disturbed for many long and lonely decades. The temperature in the cellar was a constant, biting chill that seemed to seep through the thick wool of a jacket and settle deep within the marrow of the bones. The light was a dull, flickering yellow that cast long and distorted shadows across the piles of discarded furniture and rusted metal scraps that littered the floor. There was a faint, misleading smell of lavender oil that lingered in the corners, a strange detail that felt entirely out of place here. Pierre was a 60-year-old mason who had spent his entire life working with the hidden bones of the city, and he was a man who understood the language of stone better than the language of people. He moved with a careful and deliberate grace, his eyes focused on a section of the wall that seemed just a bit too thick for the rest of the layout of the storage room. He was currently tasked with a routine renovation, a job he approached with his usual quiet dignity. Long before Pierre ever arrived with his hammer, a woman named Marie had lived in the apartment directly above his head, and she was a person who was defined by the incredible warmth of her spirit. She was a 55-year-old grandmother who was famous throughout the district for the vibrant blue hydrangeas she grew on her balcony every summer. Marie was the kind of person who always had a kind word for the local shopkeepers and a gentle smile for the neighborhood. She worked as a professional seamstress in a small shop just 3 streets away, her fingers moving with a lightning-fast precision that spoke of decades of dedicated and passionate labor. Marie would spend her days surrounded by the smell of expensive silk and the rhythmic clicking of her sewing machine, a sound that she found deeply comforting and familiar. She took great pride in the way she could turn a simple bolt of cloth into a beautiful piece of wearable art. Every single morning, Marie would walk to the local bakery to buy a fresh baguette, the steam rising from the crust and smelling of yeast, and the simple promise of a new and beautiful day. She would stop to feed the neighborhood birds, her pockets always filled with a few spare crumbs that she shared with a quiet and genuine joy. Marie believed that the world was a fundamentally good place, and she treated everyone she met with a level of respect that was truly rare. She was known for her habit of knitting small, soft scarves for the children who lived in her building, often leaving them on their doorsteps during the coldest months of the winter. Marie never expected a thank you or any form of recognition. She simply wanted to know that the little ones were warm and safe when they left for school. Her neighbors viewed her as a sort of quiet guardian, a constant presence of kindness in a world that could often feel very cold. Marie's greatest dream, the one she spoke about with a wistful and distant smile while she worked, was that someday she and her husband Jean would retire to a small cottage in the countryside. She wanted a place with a large, sprawling garden where her grandchildren could run through the tall grass while she sat on a porch and watched the sunset. She spent years carefully setting aside every spare franc she earned, keeping them in an ornate wooden box under her bed. She imagined the smell of the damp earth and the sound of the wind through the Burgundy hills, a peaceful landscape that felt 1,000 miles away from the noise and the fog of the city. Marie believed that her life was a steady journey toward that final goal, and she viewed every day of hard work as a small but necessary step toward her ultimate happiness. She was a woman who lived for the future, fueled by the hope of a simple life filled with natural beauty. She had been married to Jean for over 30 years, and to Marie, he was the steady and unshakable anchor of her entire existence, a man she trusted with every secret of her heart. They had built a life together that was woven as tightly as the threads of the expensive silk she handled at the sewing shop, a bond that she believed was unbreakable. Marie felt a sense of absolute security in their home, a sanctuary where the outside world could never reach her. Every evening after dinner, Marie would walk down the narrow stone stairs to the basement to check on the large, cast-iron furnace that provided the heat for their entire living space. She always carried a small, brass furnace key that had been worn smooth from decades of constant use, its surface gleaming with a dull, golden luster in the light of the stairwell. To Marie, that little key was a symbol of her responsibility and the comfort of her warm, cozy home. She loved the mechanical hum of the machine and the way it made the floorboards of the apartment feel warm beneath her feet on the coldest nights of the year. The basement was a place she visited daily, and she never once felt a sense of fear or unease in the shadows of the underground storage rooms. It was just another part of her routine, a mundane task that reinforced the stability and the peace of the life she had worked so hard to create for her family. In 1994, the apartment was filled with the comforting sound of a boiling kettle and the sweet smell of lavender laundry drying by the radiator on a cold evening. The golden light from the fireplace danced across the walls, creating a sense of absolute peace and warmth that made the world outside feel very far away and unimportant. Marie was sitting on the sofa, her sewing basket in her lap, feeling a profound sense of total contentment and safety. The soft rain began to tap against the window pane, a gentle and rhythmic sound that only added to the feeling of isolation and comfort within the walls of the apartment. Marie looked at Jean, who was reading his newspaper in his favorite leather chair, and she felt a wave of genuine affection for the man who had been by her side through everything. It was a perfect moment of domestic bliss, a scene that could have been painted by an artist seeking to capture peace. But then, Jean made a small, cutting remark about the cost of the hydrangeas she wanted to buy for the spring, a tiny discord that felt completely out of sync with the atmosphere. Marie felt a sudden, sharp sting of annoyance, but she quickly dismissed it with common sense, telling herself that he was just tired from a long and stressful day. She stood up to go down to the basement to check the furnace, the brass key cold and heavy in her palm as she moved. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the furnace made a strange, rhythmic rattling sound that she had never heard before, a mechanical groan that felt like a subtle warning. The air in the basement felt unnaturally heavy and damp, and the single light bulb flickered once before turning a dull, sickly yellow that cast jagged shadows. Marie paused, her hand on the cold iron of the door, wondering why the room felt so much more menacing than it ever had before. She rationalized the feeling as a result of the sudden argument upstairs, telling herself that her nerves were just a bit frayed and that the machine was simply old and in need of repair. Marie reached for the handle, her mind already moving back to the sewing project, waiting for her in the warm living room, and the blue hydrangeas she would soon plant. She believed that in a few minutes, everything would be back to normal, and the peace of the home would return. Marie heard the heavy, frantic thud of boots on the stone stairs behind her, a sound that was far too fast and too loud for the quiet of the basement. She felt a sudden, crushing impact against the back of her head that sent a white-hot flash of light across your vision and made her knees buckle. The stone floor beneath her was cold and unforgiving as she collapsed, and she could not see anything but the flickering shadows on the damp wall as the light began to fade. She tried to cry out, but her throat was tight and dry, and the only sound she could hear was the deafening roar of the furnace as it continued to hum in the darkness. Marie felt a second blow, and then a third, and the world began to dissolve into a series of jagged black streaks that danced before your eyes. She was falling into a deep and bottomless pit, far away from the light of the apartment and the sweet scent of the lavender laundry drying on the rack. You are standing in the center of the dark basement, and the only sound is the heavy, ragged sound of your own breathing and the distant, mechanical hum of the machine. You are Jean, and in this heartbeat, you are looking down at the silent form of your wife lying on the cold stone floor. You have to decide, do you run for help and admit what you have done in a moment of rage, or do you reach for the stack of bricks and the wet mortar sitting in the dark corner? Jean realized in that moment of absolute clarity that his secret would now become a permanent part of the house, a shadow that would live within the foundation for years. He began to work with a level of frantic, mechanical precision that was born from a state of total psychological shock and a desperate need for survival. He cleared away a section of the wall behind the furnace and placed the body inside, his hands moving quickly in the flickering yellow light. He meticulously rebuilt the brickwork, layer by layer, until the wall looked exactly as it had before the argument had even begun, a perfect and seamless mask for his crime. He told the neighbors that Marie has simply packed a bag and left him in the middle of the night to seek out a new life in the countryside. For the next 18 years, he lived in that very same apartment, sitting in his favorite leather chair and listening to the hum of the furnace below. The cause of Marie's disappearance was not a journey to a cottage in Burgundy, but a sudden and violent explosion of domestic rage that had been hidden behind 18 years of silence. The brass furnace key, the anchor of her daily routine and the symbol of her domestic pride, had been tossed into the wet mortar and buried alongside her. It was a silent witness to the brutal truth that had been entombed within the very foundation of the place she called home. In February of 2012, Pierre the Mason struck that hollow section of the wall and felt a sudden, sickening resistance that did not feel like stone or ancient brick. As the old mortar crumbled away under his hammer, he saw a small, mummified human foot wearing a simple leather shoe, a sight that made him drop his tools in pure terror. The forensic teams arrived hours later, carefully dismantling the wall to reveal the tragic secret hidden inside. The remains were identified as Marie through DNA matching with her surviving relatives, finally bringing a definitive end to the mystery that had haunted the district for 18 years. Jean was eventually located in a local nursing home, where he had been living since his health began to fail a few years prior to the discovery. When the police confronted him with the evidence from the basement, the elderly man let out a long, weary sigh and admitted to everything. He told the investigators that he had killed Marie during a sudden argument about the flowers, and that he had entombed her behind the furnace because he could not bear the thought of being alone. He had lived in that space for nearly 2 decades, knowing all along that she was right there with him, just inches away from the floor where he walked every single day. His confession was dry and clinical, lacking any sense of the remorse or the horror of his actions. Jean was eventually sentenced to a term of imprisonment for his crimes, but his age and failing health meant that he would spend the remainder of his life in a medical facility rather than a cell. The legal ending provided a sense of justice for Marie's family, but it could never truly erase the 18 years of silence and the horrific nature of her final resting place. The case became a chilling example of the darkness that can hide within a seemingly normal life. The story of the woman in the wall remains a haunting fade in the history of Lyon, a reminder that the people we think we know best can harbor the most terrifying of secrets. Marie's hydrangeas never bloomed on that balcony again, and the apartment building was eventually renovated, but the memory of the mummified remains continues to linger. It is a story of a life stolen by a single moment of rage, and a secret that was kept for an entire lifetime in the dark. As a narrator, I often reflect on the security illusion of our own homes, the belief that the walls around us are a shield against the dangers of the world when they can just as easily become a tomb. We trust the foundations of our lives to be solid and true, but sometimes the most terrifying things are not lurking in the shadows outside, but are built directly into the very structures we inhabit. It is a sobering thought that the most familiar places can be the most alien. Today, utilizing state-of-the-art methods, forensic archaeology has developed new, non-invasive scanning techniques that can detect biological anomalies behind thick stone and concrete walls without ever moving a single brick. These high-frequency sensors can identify the specific chemical signatures of decomposition, even after decades have passed, making it nearly impossible for a perpetrator to hide a body. Today, Marie would have been found within weeks, not 18 years. From a killer hiding a single body within the small, mummified walls of an apartment to a mystery hidden across an entire ocean, the scale of what we do not know is often staggering. While a woman in France was found just inches away from her husband, a young woman in Greece was about to be discovered in a way that pointed to a dark and complex network stretching across the vast blue of the Mediterranean. She was found in a rug, but her story was just beginning. July 19th, 2012, Chicago, Illinois. The city air was thick with the humid heat of midsummer and the constant, low-frequency hum of traffic from the nearby expressway. The smell of hot asphalt mixed with the sweet, heavy scent of blooming lilies from a neighbor's garden. The afternoon light was a hazy, golden orange that shimmered off the glass of the skyscrapers in the distance, creating a sense of restless and heavy energy. The sound of a distant siren wailed through the concrete canyons, a sharp and lonely cry that was quickly swallowed by the rhythmic clatter of the elevated train passing overhead. High above, the sky was a deep, bruised shade of purple as a summer thunderstorm began to gather on the horizon, the air suddenly turning electric and still. It was a moment where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first heavy drop of rain to break the oppressive heat. Into this sweltering afternoon stepped a man named Uruj Khan, a 46-year-old business owner who moved with a newfound spring in his step and a wide, beaming smile. He was currently carrying a large bag of fresh groceries, his fingers gripping the plastic handles as he navigated the uneven sidewalk with a sense of purpose. Uruj was a man defined by his relentless work ethic and his deep, unwavering commitment to providing a better life for his daughter. He was wearing a simple, short-sleeved button-down shirt that was neatly pressed, a habit from his decades of working in the dry cleaning industry. His hands were thick and calloused, with the faint scent of starch and industrial steam still clinging to his skin even on his day off. He stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow, his dark eyes sparkling with a secret joy that he had been carrying with him since the early hours of the previous morning. Uruj had spent the last 20 years building a reputation as the most reliable and honest businessman in his corner of the city, a man who viewed a handshake as a sacred contract. He grew up in a tiny village in Pakistan, where the days were spent laboring in the fields, and the nights were filled with the sound of his father telling stories of a land of opportunity across the sea. He had arrived in America with nothing but a suitcase and a burning desire to win. Every single morning for 2 decades, Uruj would wake up at 4 a.m. to open his shop, the smell of fresh linen and chemical cleaner greeting him like an old friend. He took immense pride in the way he could remove a stubborn stain that other cleaners had given up on, viewing each garment as a small puzzle that required his expert touch. He was a man who found deep satisfaction in the quiet, repetitive labor that allowed him to build a stable life. He was known for his habit of keeping a bowl of colorful hard candies on the counter for the children of his customers, a small gesture of kindness that made his shop a favorite stop in the neighborhood. Uruj believed that a successful business was built on relationships, not just transactions, and he knew the names of the grandchildren of every regular who walked through his door. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose presence provided a sense of continuity. Just a few days earlier, Uruj had walked into a convenience store to buy a simple scratch-off lottery ticket, a rare indulgence that he allowed himself only once or twice a year. He had scratched the silver coating away with a weathered copper penny, his heart skipping a beat as the numbers began to align in a way that seemed almost impossible. He had won the top prize of $1 million, a sum of money that felt like a gift from the heavens themselves. The moment he realized he had won, he did not scream or jump for joy. Instead, he sat quietly in his car for nearly an hour, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He thought about all the years of working in the heat of the dry cleaning press, the long nights of worrying about rent, and the sacrifices he had made to ensure his daughter had the best education. He felt a profound sense of relief, as if a heavy stone had finally been lifted from his chest. He spent the rest of that day wandering through the aisles of a high-end department store, looking at the things he had always deemed too expensive for a man in his position. He bought a new silk tie for himself and a beautiful gold locket for his daughter, the metal cool and heavy in his hand. He felt like he was finally being invited to join a world that he had spent his entire life observing from the outside, a world of luxury and absolute financial security. Uruj imagined the look on his daughter's face when he told her that she would never have to worry about student loans or the cost of her dream wedding someday. He felt a deep sense of paternal pride, knowing that he had finally fulfilled the promise he made to her when she was just a baby. To Uruj, the money was not about greed or excess, but about the ability to say yes to every dream his family had ever dared to whisper in the quiet of the night. He began to make plans to expand his business, envisioning a second location with the most modern equipment and a staff of employees who would be treated with the same respect he gave his clients. He wanted to create a legacy that would last for generations, a name that would be synonymous with quality and integrity in the city of Chicago. Every mile he walked that afternoon felt like a victory lap, a celebration of the man he had become through years of toil. His greatest dream, the one he kept tucked away in the deepest part of his heart, was to return to his village in Pakistan and build a state-of-the-art medical clinic for the poor. He remembered the long walks his mother had to take to see a doctor, and he wanted to ensure that no one else in his hometown would ever have to suffer in silence. He viewed the lottery win as a divine mandate to do good in the world, a chance to leave behind a truly meaningful mark. As he arrived at his front door, he could hear the sound of his family laughing inside, a sound that made him feel like the luckiest man in the entire world. He He took a moment to look at the sunset, the sky, a vibrant wash of pink and gold that seemed to mirror the optimism in his own soul. He felt that the universe was finally in perfect balance, and that the long years of hardship were simply a preparation for the incredible bounty that was now overflowing in his life. Sitting prominently on his mantel, leaning against a gold-framed photograph of his family, was a massive, oversized ceremonial cardboard check for $1 million. It was bright yellow and featured his name written in bold, black ink, a physical manifestation of the incredible luck that had recently changed his entire world. To Uruj, that heavy piece of cardboard was a golden ticket, a shield that would protect his family from the hardships of poverty forever. He had stood in front of the television cameras only 24 hours earlier, holding that check with a humble smile while the reporters asked him what he planned to do with his fortune. He had told them that he was just a simple man who wanted to take care of his family and give back to his community, a statement that had won the hearts of everyone watching. The check was a symbol of his transition from a life of labor to a life of absolute and total freedom. On the evening of July 20th, the atmosphere in the Khan household was one of absolute celebration and profound peace. The kitchen was filled with the mouth-watering scent of traditional kofta, a spicy meatball dish that was Uruj's absolute favorite meal in the entire world. The warm, golden light of the chandelier danced across the table, casting a soft glow on the faces of his loved ones as they gathered together to share a meal and toast to their luck. The sound of soft music played from a small radio in the corner, a gentle melody that mixed with the rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fan moving the warm summer air. Uruj sat at the head of the table, his heart full as he looked at his wife and his daughter, feeling a sense of security that he had never known in all his 46 years. He felt that the walls of his home were a fortress, a sanctuary where nothing could ever reach them or cause them any harm. The air was filled with the sweet scent of jasmine tea brewing on the stove and the faint, earthy aroma of the spices that had been carefully ground by hand for the evening meal. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the only sound being the distant bark of a dog and the low hum of the city that felt a world away from the intimacy of the dining room. It was a perfect moment of domestic bliss, a scene that represented the pinnacle of everything Uruj had worked for. He reached out and touched the hand of his wife, feeling the warmth of her skin and the strength of the bond they had built through decades of struggle and triumph. They spoke in low, excited voices about the travel brochures they had spent the afternoon looking over, dreaming of the white sand beaches and the ancient ruins they would soon visit. The future felt like a vast and beautiful landscape, stretching out before them with infinite possibilities and no limits. As Uruj took a large, hungry bite of the savory meat, he noticed a very slight, bitter aftertaste that reminded him of crushed almonds or a burnt spice he could not quite name. He paused for a fraction of a second, his fork hovering in midair as he tried to identify the flavor that felt just a bit out of sync with the usual richness of the dish. He looked at the plate, wondering if a stray piece of charred onion had somehow found its way into his specific portion. He felt a small, nagging sense of disorientation, a tiny wrong note in the middle of a perfect symphony, but he quickly used common sense to dismiss the feeling as a result of his own nerves. He told himself that the intense excitement of the last 2 days had simply made his senses a bit more acute than usual, and that his wife's cooking was, as always, beyond reproach. He did not want to ruin the mood of the celebration with a complaint about a minor culinary detail. He took another bite, forcing himself to focus on the conversation and the laughter of his daughter, trying to ignore the way the bitter flavor seemed to be spreading across the back of his tongue. He rationalized that perhaps a new brand of seasoning had been used, or that the heat of the kitchen had slightly altered the chemistry of the spices. He smiled, swallowed the food, and took a long sip of his water, believing that the strange sensation would soon vanish. Now, the world is beginning to turn into a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion and sound as your heart suddenly hammers against your ribs with a violent intensity. You hear a high-pitched ringing in your ears that grows louder with every passing second, drowning out the voices of your family and the music from the radio. You try to take a deep breath, but your chest feels like it has been crushed by a massive weight, and the air refuses to enter your lungs. You feel a sudden, icy numbness spreading from your fingertips up into your arms, a sensation that makes it impossible to hold onto the heavy silver fork you were using just moments ago. You try to stand up, but your legs feel like they are made of water, and the floor beneath your feet begins to tilt and sway like the deck of a ship in a storm. The bright golden light of the chandelier turns into a series of jagged black streaks that dance before your glazed eyes. You try to call out for help, but your throat is tight and dry, and only a soft, raspy gurgle manages to escape your lips as you collapse back into your chair. You see your daughter's face through a thick gray mist, her expression changing from joy to a mask of pure and unadulterated horror as she realizes that something is terribly wrong. You are falling into a deep and bottomless pit of darkness, far away from the warmth of the room and the dreams you once held. You are sitting directly across the table, watching the man you love take what will be his very last bite of food before his entire world comes crashing down in a heap of broken dreams. You see his eyes go wide with a sudden, silent plea for help as his hands reach up to clutch at his throat, his face turning a sickly mottled shade of blue in the soft light. In this heartbeat, you have to decide. Do you scream for help, or do you look at the person who cooked the meal? The initial medical examination suggested that Yuruj had died of natural causes, perhaps a sudden heart attack brought on by the immense stress and excitement of his recent lottery win. However, his brother remained unconvinced, sensing that something was deeply wrong with the timing of his death and the behavior of those in the house. After a long and difficult legal battle, the body was exhumed, and a toxicology report revealed a lethal dose of cyanide in his system. In the crime scene photographs taken of the living room, the oversized ceremonial check can be seen leaning against the wall, its bright yellow surface a cruel contrast to the tragedy. The very object that was supposed to bring him a lifetime of peace and security had instead become a beacon for the greed of those closest to him. The check remained uncashed, a $1 million promise that was buried in the dark earth alongside the man who had worked so hard to truly earn it. The investigation into the death of Yuruj Khan focused heavily on his wife and father-in-law, uncovering a history of mounting financial disputes and hidden tensions within the family. From a criminological standpoint, the most dangerous betrayals are often those born from a sudden change in fortune, which acts as a catalyst for long-simmering resentment. Despite the evidence, no one was ever charged, as the lack of physical proof made a conviction nearly impossible. It is a profound and dark irony that the luckiest day of Yuruj's life turned out to be the day that sealed his fate and led to his ultimate destruction at the hands of those he loved. He had spent his entire life working to build a wall of safety for his daughter, only for that wall to be torn down by the very people he thought would help him maintain it. He died with the taste of his favorite meal in his mouth and the weight of a $1 million dream that would never be realized. Bringing us to the present moment, forensic toxicologists have developed highly sensitive hair strand analysis techniques that can detect cyanide metabolites even years after a burial. These modern tests allow investigators to reconstruct a precise timeline of toxin ingestion, often revealing if a victim was being slowly poisoned over several weeks before the final dose. Today, the mystery of what happened in that Chicago kitchen would likely be solved with a single lock of hair. From a poisoned meal shared in the heart of a busy American city to a poisoned cup of tea offered on the slopes of a sacred Japanese mountain, the face of greed remains the same. While one man was betrayed by his own family over a lottery check, others were about to be led into a meditative trap by a killer who wore the robes of a holy man and carried the scent of ancient herbs through the forest. August 12, 2012. 3:45 in the afternoon, Mount Hiei, Japan. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and the ancient, earthy perfume of cedar trees that had stood for 1,000 years. High above, the only sound was the rhythmic, metallic buzzing of cicadas, a sound that seemed to pulse with the very heat of the late summer sun. The light filtered through the canopy in jagged, emerald streaks that danced on the forest floor. A small, black raven perched on a weathered stone lantern, its head tilting as it watched the shadows stretch across the trail. There was a faint, misleading scent of sweet jasmine floating on the breeze, a detail that felt out of sync with the rugged, wild nature of the mountain ridges. Emerging from the dense thicket of bamboo was a man named Kenji, a 42-year-old salaryman from Kyoto who moved with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke of a deep and heavy exhaustion. Kenji had spent the last 20 years working in a cramped office building where the only natural light came from a flickering computer screen and the humming fluorescent tubes overhead. He was a man who lived his life by a strict and punishing schedule, always arriving 30 minutes before his supervisor and leaving long after the city trains had stopped running for the night. He felt as though the vibrant world outside was slowly passing him by while he was trapped in a gray box. His only true joy in life was visiting his elderly mother in the countryside, where they would sit in silence and watch the dragonflies hover over the rice paddies. Kenji was a man of immense quiet strength, a person who never complained about the weight of his responsibilities or the loneliness that seemed to follow him through the crowded city streets. He viewed his work as a necessary sacrifice for the comfort of those he loved, a silent pact he had made with his own heart. He often dreamed that someday he would finally leave the city behind and become a wandering pilgrim, traveling from one ancient temple to another, until he found a sense of true and lasting peace. Kenji believed that the mountains held the answers to the questions he was too tired to ask during his long hours at the office. He viewed this hike on Mount Hiei as a small trial run for the life he hoped to lead when he was finally free from the demands of his corporate career. In the pocket of his hiking vest, he carried a small, hand-carved wooden tea bowl that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had taught him the importance of the tea ceremony. The wood was dark and polished from decades of use, and it felt warm and familiar against the palm of his hand whenever he reached for his water bottle. To Kenji, that little bowl was an anchor to his heritage, and a symbol of the simple, quiet life he desperately wanted to reclaim for himself. He stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow, looking up at the towering trees and feeling a profound sense of awe at the age and the scale of the forest around him. He felt very small in the presence of the mountain, but it was a feeling that brought him comfort rather than fear. It was as if the trees were guardians, protecting the sacred ground from the noise and the frantic energy of the modern world that lay just a few miles away in the valley below. Kenji took a deep breath, the cool mountain air filling his lungs and making him feel more alive than he had in many long and grueling months. He could hear the distant chime of a temple bell, a low and resonating sound that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his boots. He felt that every step he took up the steep and winding path was a step away from his old life and toward a version of himself that was much closer to the natural rhythms of the earth. The trail was narrow and lined with ancient stone markers that were covered in a thick layer of velvet green moss, their inscriptions worn away by centuries of wind and rain. Kenji felt like a guest in a very old and very private home, and he moved with a level of respect that bordered on the religious. He didn't see another soul for several hours, a rare and beautiful isolation that allowed him to finally hear the sound of his own thoughts in the deep and heavy silence. He imagined his grandfather sitting on a similar ridge, looking out at the same mountains and feeling the same sense of connection to the ancestors who had walked these paths before them. Kenji felt a surge of paternal pride, knowing that he was carrying on a tradition of seeking clarity in the wild places of the world. He believed that the mountain was a neutral force, a place where a man could be stripped of his titles and his worries until only his true self remained. As he reached a high plateau where the trees opened up to reveal a stunning view of Lake Biwa, the world seemed to hold its breath in a moment of absolute and perfect peace. The sound of a small mountain stream trickled nearby, a gentle and melodic bubbling that mixed with the soft rustle of the leaves in the light breeze. The golden light of the late afternoon bathed the entire landscape in a warm and protective glow that made the mountains look like they were made of silk. The air was filled with the sweet, clean scent of pine and the faint, earthy aroma of the damp soil, creating a sensory environment that felt as safe as a sanctuary. Kenji sat down on a flat stone, his heart full as he looked out at the water shimmering in the distance like a field of fallen stars. He felt a sense of security that he had never known in the city, a feeling of being completely and utterly protected by the ancient spirits that were said to haunt these ridges. The only sound was the occasional call of a bird and the steady, comforting rhythm of his own breathing as he relaxed his tired muscles. He felt that the walls of the world had finally fallen away, leaving him in a space where nothing could ever reach him or cause him any harm. It was a perfect moment of spiritual bliss, a scene that represented the pinnacle of everything he had hoped to find when he started his journey from the crowded streets of Kyoto that morning. But then, as he prepared to continue his climb, he noticed a tall figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a man dressed in the heavy, black robes of a wandering monk. The stranger was standing perfectly still, his head bowed as if in deep prayer, and he carried a long wooden staff that was weathered and worn. Kenji felt a sudden, sharp sting of surprise, but he quickly dismissed it as a normal encounter on a mountain that was famous for its many sacred temples. The monk looked up and offered a slow, gentle bow, his face lined with age and a look of profound and quiet wisdom that made Kenji feel an immediate sense of respect. The stranger reached into his robes and pulled out a small iron kettle, gesturing toward the nearby stream and then toward Kenji's wooden tea bowl. His voice was a low and soothing rasp, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone, as he offered to share a cup of blessed tea with the weary traveler. Kenji felt a wave of gratitude for the kind gesture, believing that he had been granted a rare and auspicious meeting with a holy man on this sacred ground. He watched as the monk carefully built a small fire and began to brew the tea. The steam rising in thin white curls that smelled of ancient herbs and wood smoke. He rationalized the strange, slightly bitter undertone of the scent as a characteristic of the rare mountain plants that the monks often used for their rituals. He took the wooden bowl from the stranger's hands, the heat of the liquid warming his fingers and the steam clouding his vision for a brief and fleeting second. He smiled at the monk, feeling a sense of deep and lasting connection to the traditions of his people and the spirit of the mountain itself. He believed that this was the moment of clarity he had been seeking, a simple act of shared humanity in a place where the modern world felt like a distant and fading dream. As he took a long, slow sip of the tea, he noticed a very slight, numbing sensation on the tip of his tongue, a tiny wrong note that felt like the prick of 1,000 needles. He paused for a fraction of a second, his bowl hovering in midair, as he tried to identify the flavor that was both sweet and terrifyingly metallic at the same time. He looked at the monk, wondering if the herbs were meant to be this potent, or if the heat of the water had altered their natural taste. He felt a small, nagging sense of disorientation, a tiny vibration in the air that seemed to signal a shift in the rhythm of the afternoon, but he quickly used logic to dismiss the feeling. He told himself that the high altitude and the physical exertion of the climb had simply made his senses a bit more sensitive than they usually were. He smiled again, swallowed the rest of the tea, and leaned back against the stone, believing that the strange sensation would soon pass away. Now, the world is beginning to turn into a terrifying and disjointed blur of sound as your heart suddenly hammers against your ribs with a violent intensity. You hear a high-pitched ringing in your ears that grows louder with every passing second, drowning out the sound of the stream and the rustle of the leaves. You try to stand up, but your legs feel like they are made of heavy lead, and the ground beneath your feet begins to tilt and sway like a ship in a storm. You feel a sudden, icy paralysis spreading from your throat down into your chest, a sensation that makes it impossible to take in the air that you so desperately need to survive. You try to reach out for the monk, but your arms are frozen by your side, and your fingers refuse to follow the desperate commands of your brain. The bright, golden light of the late afternoon turns into a series of jagged black streaks that dance before your glazed and wide-open eyes. You are Kenji, and in this heartbeat, you are staring up at the man in the black robes, whose face has changed from a mask of wisdom to a mask of cold and clinical indifference. You see him reach out and take your wooden bowl from your paralyzed hands, his movements slow and methodical as he begins to pack away his things. You are falling into a deep and bottomless pit of total darkness, far away from the peace of the mountain and the dreams you once held. You are sitting just a few feet away, watching a man you have never met before struggle for his very life while the sun begins to set over the silent and ancient ridges. You see his eyes go wide with a sudden, silent plea for help as his body begins to stiffen in a meditative position, his belongings neatly stacked nearby. In this heartbeat, you have to decide, do you try to scream for help, or do you realize that the man in the robes is already looking for his next guest? The investigation into the series of suspicious deaths on Mount Hiei would eventually reveal a pattern that pointed to a predator who used the sacred nature of the mountain as a shield. Forensic teams found several bodies in the dense forests, each one posed in a seated position that suggested a peaceful end, but the autopsies told a much more violent story. They discovered traces of a rare and paralyzing toxin known as monkshood in the systems of every single victim. The perpetrator was never identified, leaving the mountain with a lingering and terrifying reputation for spirited away disappearances that continue to haunt the local communities. From a forensic standpoint, the use of monkshood is a signature of a killer who wants absolute control over their victims' final moments, ensuring they are fully conscious but unable to move. The anchor of Kenji's heritage, the wooden bowl, was never found, likely taken as a trophy by the black monk. It is a profound and dark irony that the very act of seeking spiritual peace and connection to tradition led Kenji directly into the hands of a man who used those values to destroy him. He had traveled to the mountain to find a sense of clarity, but instead, he found a silence that was cold, calculated, and entirely without mercy. He died in a place of absolute beauty, staring at a view he would never get to enjoy, while the man in the black robes vanished into the trees. The case remains a haunting example of how the most sacred places can be turned into hunting grounds by those who understand the specific vulnerabilities of the human spirit. Kenji's mother waited for him to return home, but the only thing that ever came back from the mountain was a sense of profound and lingering unease. The ridges of Mount Hiei remain a popular destination for hikers, but many now walk with a sense of caution that was not there before the year 2012. His story is a fade into the long shadows of the forest, a reminder that the robes of a holy man can hide a darkness that is more ancient and visceral than the mountain itself. Kenji was a man who wanted to be free of the city, and in the most tragic way possible, the black monk granted him a permanent and silent release from the world of men. He remains a ghost on the trail, a warning to those who follow in his footsteps that not every offer of peace is what it seems. As we examine these cases today, forensic biology has developed alkaloid isotope analysis, a technique that can identify the specific soil chemistry of where a toxic plant was grown. This means that today, investigators could take a sample of the monk's hood found in a victim's system and trace it back to a specific patch of forest or a private garden where the killer was cultivating the poison. Today, the black monk would have left a biological trail leading directly to his home. The survival reversal is a terrifying reality. The mountain that was supposed to save Kenji's soul became the very thing that claimed his life in a moment of absolute vulnerability. While one man was lost to the shadows of a sacred peak in Japan, a young woman in the heart of Greece was about to be discovered in a way that defied explanation. She was found wrapped in a rug in an abandoned warehouse, a blue-eyed mystery that the world had seemingly forgotten. July 14th, 2012, 11:30 in the morning, Piraeus, Greece. The air was thick with the scent of heavy diesel fuel and the salty, rotting smell of the Mediterranean Sea that seemed to cling to everything. High above, the only sound was the rhythmic, metallic screeching of rusty cranes moving shipping containers in the distance. The light was a blinding, pale white that shimmered off the oily surface of the harbor water, making the world look like it was melting. Inside an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the industrial district, the temperature was a stifling and stagnant heat that seemed to press against the skin like a wet blanket. There was a faint, misleading scent of old lavender and expensive wool floating in the air, a detail that felt out of place among the rusted machinery and piles of rotting timber. A single, thin beam of sunlight cut through the dust, illuminating a patch of floor that seemed far too clean for such a derelict space. Emerging from the shadows of the harbor was a young woman named Elena, who was 22 years old and possessed a spirit that was as vibrant and restless as the ocean waves. She moved with a quiet, observant grace, her bright blue eyes scanning the horizon for a sign of the future she had traveled so far to find. Elena was a woman of immense courage, a person who had left behind everything she knew to chase a dream of safety and a place to finally call home. She had spent the last 3 months traveling from a small coastal village in North Africa, her journey a series of long and dangerous nights spent on crowded boats and in the back of cramped trucks. Elena was a dreamer who found beauty in the smallest things, often spending hours sketching the local birds she saw along the way in a small, weathered notebook. She believed that the world was a vast and open book, and she was determined to read every single page of it. Back in her village, Elena was known for her incredible artistic talent and the way she could capture the movement of a wing or the flash of a feather with just a few strokes of her charcoal. Her mother's kitchen always smelled of toasted cumin and fresh bread, a warm and safe environment where Elena felt truly understood and loved. She would sit by the window for hours, watching the hummingbirds dart through the garden, their tiny bodies a blur of iridescent green and gold. She decided to get a small tattoo of a hummingbird on the side of her neck, a permanent mark that represented her desire to remain small, fast, and impossible to catch. To Elena, the bird was a symbol of her own soul, a creature that could travel vast distances despite its fragile appearance. She felt that as long as she carried the hummingbird with her, she would never truly be lost or alone, no matter how far she wandered from the familiar shores of her childhood home. Elena's greatest dream, the one she whispered to the stars during the long nights on the Mediterranean, was that someday she would open her own art gallery in a city where the streets were paved with stone. She wanted to show the world the beauty she had seen in the faces of the people she met on her journey, and the incredible landscapes that few others ever bothered to notice. She viewed her migration not as an act of desperation, but as a bold and necessary artistic pilgrimage. She carried a small, embroidered handkerchief that her mother had given her on the day she left. A piece of soft white cotton with a tiny blue flower stitched into the corner. Elena would often press the fabric against her face when the journey felt too long, the faint scent of her mother's kitchen still clinging to the threads. To her, that little handkerchief was a promise that no matter how far she traveled, she would always have a piece of home with her in the dark. She was a person of immense kindness, often sharing her meager food supplies with the other travelers she met in the shadows of the transit camps. Elena believed that even in the middle of a struggle for survival, there was always room for a moment of shared humanity and a gentle word of encouragement. She was a beacon of hope for many of the women she traveled with, her bright blue eyes always focused on the horizon and the promise of a better and brighter life ahead. As the boat finally reached the shores of Greece in the early summer of 2012, Elena felt a surge of incredible joy and a profound sense of total accomplishment. She stepped onto the dock at Piraeus, the ground feeling solid and real beneath her tired feet for the first time in many weeks. She believed that the hardest part of her journey was finally over, and that the city of Athens would be the canvas upon which she would paint the rest of her life. The warehouse where she eventually found temporary shelter was a massive cavern of steel and stone, a place where the sounds of the port were muffled and distant. Elena found a quiet corner near a stack of old shipping crates, where the air was relatively cool and the shadows were deep enough to hide her from the prying eyes of the local authorities. She felt a sense of peace in the stillness of the building, a rare moment of privacy in a journey that had been so crowded. The sound of the waves lapping against the harbor walls was a steady and comforting rhythm that reminded her of the village she had left behind so many months ago. The light from the moon filtered through the high, cracked windows of the warehouse, casting long and silver fingers across the dusty floor. Elena felt a deep sense of security in the darkness, believing that she was finally safe from the dangers that had followed her across the sea from North Africa. She took out her small notebook and began to sketch the silhouette of a gull she had seen earlier that day, her charcoal moving with a confident and practiced ease. The air was filled with the faint, earthy scent of the sea and the metallic aroma of the old warehouse, a sensory environment that felt both strange and oddly familiar. Elena felt that she was on the verge of something incredible, a new chapter of her existence that was about to unfold in the morning light. But then, as she was preparing to sleep, she noticed something very strange. In the middle of the large, empty floor of the warehouse, just a few feet away from her corner, it was a large, heavy object wrapped in a thick layer of dark fabric, a shape that felt entirely out of sync with the piles of discarded wood and rusted metal. She stood up, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs, and walked slowly toward the center of the room to investigate the anomaly. As she got closer, the misleading scent of lavender and expensive wool became much stronger, a rich and luxurious aroma that did not belong in a derelict industrial building. She realized that the object was a high-quality Persian rug, its intricate patterns of deep red and gold shimmering faintly in the moonlight. It was a piece of art that belonged in a wealthy residence, not abandoned on the cold and dirty floor of a harbor warehouse in the middle of the night. Elena felt a sudden, sharp sting of disorientation, a tiny wrong note in the middle of the peaceful evening that seemed to signal a shift in the rhythm of the world. She reached out to touch the fabric, her fingers feeling the soft, dense pile of the wool, and she wondered who could have left such a valuable treasure behind. She rationalized the situation as perhaps a lost shipment, or a piece of furniture that had been discarded during a recent and hasty move. She noticed a small white object tucked into the edge of the rug, and as she pulled it out, she realized it was her own embroidered handkerchief with the blue flower. Elena felt a wave of intense nausea wash over her, a feeling of pure and unadulterated terror as she realized that her most precious anchor had been moved while she was sketching. She looked back at the shadows, but the warehouse was silent and still, the only sound being the distant roar of the sea. Now, everything is happening in a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion as you hear the sharp, loud clicking of a lock being turned in the distant warehouse door. You feel a sudden, crushing pressure against your throat that makes it impossible to scream for help or to take in the air that you need. The bright, silver light of the moon turns into a series of jagged black streaks that dance before your glazed eyes as you are forced down onto the cold floor. You are a warehouse worker who has come in early on a Monday morning to begin the task of clearing out the old crates for a new shipment of industrial parts. You see a large Persian rug sitting in the middle of the floor, and as you go to move it, you feel a sudden and sickening weight that does not feel like wool. In this heartbeat, you have to decide. Do you pull back the fabric and look at what is hidden inside, or do you run for the police outside? You are the discoverer, and as you unroll the rug, you see the face of a young woman with bright blue eyes that are wide open and staring at a world she will never see again. You see a small hummingbird tattoo on the side of her neck, a delicate mark of freedom that has been silenced by a violence you cannot even begin to comprehend. You find a small, white handkerchief with a blue flower clutched in her hand, a final piece of a life that has been discarded. The investigation into the death of the blue-eyed Jane Doe would eventually uncover a dark and complex network of human trafficking that stretched across the Mediterranean. Forensic teams spent months trying to identify the woman, but her name remained a mystery as she had no papers and no one in the city came forward to claim her. The Persian rug was of a very high quality, suggesting that she had been killed in a wealthy residence before being dumped in the port. The anchor of Elena's journey, the embroidered handkerchief that her mother had given her, was the only clue that connected her to a life beyond the warehouse walls. It was a silent witness to the brutal truth that her dream of a better life had been turned into a nightmare by people who viewed her as nothing more than a commodity. From a forensic standpoint, the dust found in her hair suggested she had recently been in a specific coastal region of North Africa. In the aftermath of the discovery, the Greek police made an emotional appeal to Interpol, sharing images of the hummingbird tattoo and the blue-eyed woman in hopes that someone would recognize her. However, the year 2012 was a time of immense social and economic chaos in the region, and many such cases were quickly buried under the weight of other tragedies. Elena remained a Jane Doe, her body buried in a nameless grave far from her home village. It is a profound and dark irony that the very art she loved and the symbol of freedom she carried on her skin were the only things that remained to tell her story to the world. She had traveled so far to find a home, only to be found in a rug that was a hollow mockery of the luxury she had hoped to achieve through her hard work and talent. She died in the middle of the night, a ghost in a city that was too busy with its own survival to notice her passing. Her story is a fade into the long and tragic history of the migration routes that claim so many lives every year. A reminder that behind every headline is a human being with a name. Elena was a daughter, an artist, and a dreamer who believed in the goodness of the world, only to be betrayed by its darkest corners. She remains a blue-eyed mystery in the records of the Piraeus police, a girl who followed a hummingbird across the sea and never came back home. As a narrator, I often reflect on the invisible threads that connect us all, and how easily those threads can be snapped by the greed and the indifference of others. We walk through the same streets and breathe the same air as people whose lives are a world away from our own, and we often fail to see the hummingbirds in our midst. It is a sobering thought that a person can vanish so completely, leaving behind only a scrap of cloth and a tattoo on a neck. Shifting to modern capabilities, forensic biology has developed multi-isotope hair analysis, a technique that can track a person's movements across the globe with incredible precision. By analyzing the carbon and nitrogen levels in a single strand of hair, investigators can determine exactly where a person lived and what they ate every month for years. Today, Elena's journey from North Africa to Greece would have been mapped in days, leading police to her village. The survival reversal is a terrifying reality. The very journey that was supposed to save Elena's life and launch her career as an artist became the path that led her to a rug. While one young woman was lost to the shadows of a Greek warehouse, a young man in Taiwan was about to find out that the digital world can be just as deadly as the physical one. He sat in a chair for 23 hours, his mind in a game, while his body was slowly shutting down. February 2nd, 2012. 3:40 in the morning, New Taipei City, Taiwan. The air was thick with the heavy, artificial scent of ozone and the stale, lingering aroma of instant beef noodles. High above, the only sound was the constant, low-frequency hum of 1,000 cooling fans spinning in unison, creating a mechanical vibration that felt like a living thing. The light was a flickering, neon blue that washed over everything in the windowless room. A slight, unnatural breeze from the air conditioning unit rattled a stack of discarded paper cups in the corner, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the rhythmic, frantic clicking of mechanical keyboards. There was a faint, misleading smell of fresh rain drifting in from the distant doorway, a detail that felt out of place in this subterranean world of glowing screens. Emerging from the shadows was a young man named Chen, who was only 23 years old. Chen moved with a slow, tired gait that suggested he had not seen the sun in many days, his eyes fixed on a specific terminal in the back of the internet cafe. He was a man of quiet habits and even quieter words, a person who felt more comfortable in the digital realms of fantasy than in the crowded and loud streets of the city. To his coworkers at the local office where he worked as an assistant, Chen was a ghost, a shadow who vanished the moment the clock struck 5. He had spent most of his young life feeling like a background character in a story that belonged to someone else, a feeling that only vanished when he logged into his favorite online battle arena. Chen was a man of immense focus and tactical brilliance, a person who could lead an army of digital warriors to victory with a series of precise and lightning-fast commands. He felt that the glowing screen was the only place where his true potential was ever truly recognized. Back in his tiny apartment, the walls were thin, and the only sound was the hum of a refrigerator and the muffled voices of neighbors he had never actually met. It was a lonely existence, but Chen found a sense of community in the glowing chat boxes and the shared goals of his online teammates. He would spend his meager earnings on the latest gaming gear, believing that a faster connection or a better mouse was the key to finally achieving the greatness he craved. In his right hand, he always carried a worn, mechanical gaming mouse that featured a very specific, high-pitched click that he found incredibly satisfying. The plastic was smooth and polished from thousands of hours of intense use, and the scroll wheel moved with a precision that he trusted more than his own hands. To Chen, that little device was an extension of his own will, a tool that allowed him to interact with a world where he was a king among men. He often dreamed that someday he would be scouted by a professional gaming organization and move to a luxury house where he would be paid to do the one thing he loved. Chen believed that his digital accomplishments would eventually translate into a life of fame and financial security, a dream that kept him going during the long and boring hours of his data entry job. He viewed every late-night session at the cafe as a necessary practice for his future career. His greatest dream, the one he shared with no one, was to finally build a life where he didn't feel the need to hide behind an avatar to feel respected and strong. He wanted to walk into a room and have people know his name, not because of his kill count, but because of the man he was in the physical world. Chen carried this hope with him like a secret flame, using it to warm his spirit when the cold reality of his isolation threatened to extinguish his drive. He was a person of immense internal discipline, often pushing his body to the absolute limit of exhaustion to finish just one more match with his friends. Chen believed that sleep was a weakness that stood in the way of his progress, and he often relied on sugary energy drinks and the adrenaline of competition to keep him awake. He felt a sense of pride in his ability to endure the physical strain of a 20-hour session without ever losing his competitive edge. As he sat down at his favorite station in the corner of the New Taipei City Cafe, the world outside the front door seemed to vanish into a distant and unimportant memory. He adjusted his headset, the soft padding muffling the sounds of the other patrons and leaving him alone with the soaring orchestral score of the game. Chen felt a surge of incredible energy as the login screen appeared, the vibrant colors reflecting in his wide and tired eyes with a sharp intensity. The cafe was a labyrinth of glowing booths and tangled wires, a place where time seemed to lose all meaning, and the only calendar that mattered was the server reset. Chen felt a sense of profound peace in the stillness of the room, a rare moment of total immersion in a world that he understood perfectly. He believed that the walls of the cafe were a protective barrier, keeping the complexities and the failures of his real life at a very safe and comfortable distance. The sound of the mechanical mouse clicking was a steady and comforting rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat, a sign that he was active and engaged in the world. The light from the monitor cast a pale violet glow on his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and the pale, translucent quality of his skin. Chen felt a deep sense of security in the dim light, believing that he was finally in the one place where he could be exactly who he wanted to be. He took a long, cold sip of a caffeinated soda, the sugar providing a momentary burst of clarity as he coordinated a complex attack with his teammates in real time. The air in the cafe was cool and dry, a sensory environment that felt both sterile and oddly comforting to a man who lived his life in the shadows. Chen felt that he was on the verge of a major breakthrough in his ranking, a milestone that would finally prove his worth to the global gaming community. But then, as he reached the 23rd hour of his continuous session, he noticed a very strange sensation in his chest, a slight fluttering that felt like a trapped bird. He paused for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the mouse as he tried to identify the feeling that was both sharp and terrifyingly hollow. He looked at the screen, wondering if the intense light was starting to cause a physical reaction in his heart after so many hours of focus. He felt a small, nagging sense of disorientation, a tiny wrong note in the middle of the digital battle that seemed to signal a shift in the rhythm of his body. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air in the cafe suddenly felt thick and heavy, as if the oxygen was being slowly replaced by the cold exhaust of the machines. He rationalized the feeling as a simple case of muscle fatigue and a need for a short break, telling himself he would stop after the match. He noticed that the clicking of his mouse sounded different, a duller and more distant noise that didn't seem to match the frantic movements of his fingers. Chen felt a wave of intense nausea wash over him, a feeling of pure and unadulterated cold that started in his feet and began to climb up his legs toward his spine. He looked around the room, but the other patrons were focused on their own screens, their faces illuminated by the same flickering neon light. Now, everything is happening in a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion as you feel a sudden, crushing weight against your chest that makes it impossible to move. You hear the high-pitched ringing of the cooling fans in your ears, a sound that grows louder and louder until it becomes a deafening roar. The bright, vibrant colors of the game turn into a series of jagged black streaks that dance before your glazed eyes as your body begins to stiffen in the chair. You are a patron sitting in the very next booth, and you have been playing the same game for the last 5 hours, your mind completely consumed by the digital world. You notice the young man next to you has stopped moving, his hands still resting on the keyboard, and his eyes fixed on a frozen screen. You assume he has finally fallen asleep after a long session, and you go back to your own match, not wanting to disturb his rest in the middle of the night. You are the witness, and for the next 9 hours, you continue to play your game while the man next to you remains in a sitting position, his body becoming cold and rigid. You don't realize that the silence from his booth is not the silence of sleep, but the silence of a heart that has finally stopped beating under the weight of exhaustion. You only notice something is wrong when a staff member tries to wake him up and finds that he is as cold as the machine. The investigation into the death of Chen Rongyu would eventually reveal a tragic and modern cause of death that sparked a global discussion on the nature of digital addiction. Forensic teams found that he had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, likely brought on by a combination of extreme exhaustion, a lack of movement, and the cold temperatures of the cafe. He had been dead for over 9 hours while the life of the internet cafe continued to pulse around him. The anchor of Chen's life, the mechanical mouse with the high-pitched click, was found resting beneath his cold and stiff hand, its light still glowing with a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was a silent witness to the brutal truth that his dream of being a hero had cost him his very existence in the physical world. From a sociological standpoint, the case highlighted the zombie-like state of extreme addiction, where the individual becomes a ghost in their own life. In the aftermath of the discovery, the images of the young man sitting upright in his chair, seemingly focused on a game while he was actually a corpse, went viral across the world. It was a haunting image that captured the terrifying power of the digital world to consume a person's entire reality until there was nothing left but a shell. Chen was buried in a quiet ceremony, far away from the neon lights and the mechanical hum of the world he had loved so much. It is a profound and dark irony that the very place where Chen went to feel alive and respected was the place where he ultimately became a forgotten and silent figure. He had traveled into the digital realm to escape the loneliness of his apartment, only to die in a room full of people who didn't even notice he was gone. He was a king in a world of pixels, but in the world of flesh and bone, he was a young man who had simply run out of time and energy. His story is a fade into the gray and flickering light of the screens that dominate so much of our modern existence, a reminder that the body has limits that the mind often ignores. Chen was a son, a dedicated worker, and a talented strategist who believed in the promise of the future, only to be betrayed by the very technology he used to build his dreams. He remains a cautionary tale in the records of Taiwan, a boy who sat down to play and never stood up. As a narrator, I often reflect on the invisible barriers that we build between ourselves and the people around us, and how a glowing screen can be the thickest wall of all. We can be inches away from someone who is suffering, yet be miles away in a world of our own making, oblivious to the reality of the person sitting right next to us. It is a sobering thought that a human heart can stop in a crowded room and remain unnoticed for an entire working day. In our current landscape of 2026, digital addiction is treated with the same medical seriousness as substance abuse, with neuroimaging showing how games can rewire the brain's reward centers. Modern internet cafes in many countries are now required to have biomonitoring sensors in the chairs that can detect a drop in heart rate or a lack of movement. Today, an alarm would have sounded in the manager's office within minutes of Chen's heart failing him in the dark. The evolution of threat is a terrifying reality. The dangers we face are no longer just physical predators in the woods, but the very tools we use to connect with one another. While one young man was lost to the digital shadows of a Taiwan cafe, a mysterious figure in the heart of Tokyo was about to prove that fire could be just as elusive and invisible as a ghost. He struck in the narrow alleys, leaving no trace on the thousands of cameras that watched the city. March 15th, 2012, 3:45 in the morning, Shinjuku, Tokyo. The air was exceptionally crisp and held the sharp, metallic tang of the city's vast rail network, mixed with the faint, sweet scent of cherry blossoms beginning to bloom in the nearby parks. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of a street-sweeping machine and the soft, electrical buzz of 1,000 neon signs flickering in the dark and narrow alleys. The light was a pale, artificial white that shimmered off the wet asphalt, casting long and jagged shadows across the passageways where the skyscrapers blocked out the stars. There was a faint, misleading scent of burnt toast floating on the breeze, a small detail that felt out of place among the sleeping neighborhood. Emerging from the shadows was a man named Haruto, who was a 60-year-old shopkeeper with a very gentle and tired face and a slow walk. Haruto had spent the last 40 years running a small, second-hand bookstore that was tucked away in a corner of the Nakano district, a place where the shelves were piled high with the forgotten stories of 1,000 different lives. He was a man of quiet habits and even quieter thoughts, a person who found a sense of profound peace in the smell of old paper and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on his wall. He moved with a slow and practiced grace. Every single evening after closing his shop, Haruto would meticulously organize the scraps of paper and cardboard boxes left behind by the neighboring businesses, placing them neatly in the recycling bins. He viewed this small act as his contribution to the order and the cleanliness of the city he loved so much. He was the kind of man who would apologize to a stray cat if he accidentally startled it while walking home through the dim and quiet back streets. He lived in a tiny apartment above his store, a space that smelled of green tea and the vanilla scent of aging book bindings. His greatest dream, the one he whispered to the moon on the rare nights when the sky was clear, was that someday he would travel to the far north to see the green fire of the aurora borealis. He had spent years saving his meager profits in a small ceramic jar, imagining the cold, clean air and the silence of the Arctic wilderness. Haruto believed that the city of Tokyo was a living, breathing entity that looked after those who treated it with respect and care. He felt a sense of absolute security in the labyrinth of alleys, believing that the thousands of surveillance cameras were like the eyes of watchful spirits. To him, the narrow paths were not dangerous or dark, but were instead the cozy hallways of a massive home where he was always welcome and always safe from any real harm. On his bedside table, right next to a stack of poetry books, sat a vintage, silver-plated pocket lighter that had belonged to his father. The metal was cool to the touch and featured an intricate engraving of a soaring crane, a symbol of longevity and peace. Haruto never used the lighter, as he had never smoked a day in his life. but he kept it polished to a mirror shine, as a way of staying connected to the man who had taught him the value of a hard day's work. He viewed the lighter as a sort of silent anchor, a heavy and solid object that grounded him in his history and his family's traditions. He would often run his thumb over the engraved wings of the crane while he thought about his upcoming trip to the north, the metal providing a sense of comfort and continuity. It was a harmless memento of a bygone era, but in the solitude of his life, it provided a sense of companionship that was both simple and very grounding. He took a final sip of his warm tea, the liquid sliding down his throat and providing a momentary distraction from the cold air that seeped through the thin walls of his apartment. The bookstore below felt heavy and stable, a fortress of knowledge that had survived the many changes of the city over the last 4 decades. Haruto felt a sense of total mastery over his small corner of the world, a feeling of absolute confidence that today was just another routine day. The alleys outside were a maze of gray stone and black shadows, a landscape that Haruto could navigate with his eyes closed if he ever needed to do so. He didn't pay much attention to the piles of recycling he had sorted earlier, viewing them as a finished task that was no longer his concern. He assumed that the only things moving in the city at this hour were the delivery trucks and the few night owls who, like him, found solace in the deep silence. His apartment was filled with the warm, comforting smell of old wood and the faint, dusty aroma of the thousands of books resting just beneath his feet. The city outside was a distant roar, a sea of white and red lights that felt a world away from the intimacy of his small living room. Haruto adjusted his glasses. Looking at the map of the north, he had pinned to the wall and felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life he had built. The vibration of a passing train was a steady, low-frequency thrum that he felt in the soles of his feet and the small of his back, a sensation that was as familiar as his own heartbeat. The neighborhood was empty of people, giving the alleys a sense of ancient and profound stillness as the city waited for the sun to rise. The silver lighter on the bedside table caught the flickering light of a neon sign outside, the crane's wings appearing to move in the dark. The air inside the apartment was still and quiet, creating an atmosphere of profound safety and isolation from the external world. Haruto leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment to imagine the shimmering green lights of the aurora dancing across a dark sky. He felt like a man who was finally on the verge of achieving his greatest ambition, a feeling of total peace that few other people ever got the chance to experience in their busy lives. But then, as he began to drift toward sleep, he noticed a very slight chemical scent drifting up through the floorboards, a smell that reminded him of cleaning fluid or perhaps a strong solvent. He paused, his eyes snapping open as he tried to identify the odor that was both sharp and terrifyingly out of place in his library. He looked toward the door, wondering if a neighbor was doing some late-night maintenance or if a delivery truck had leaked its fuel. He dismissed the smell with a quick shake of his head, telling himself that his imagination was starting to play tricks on his senses after a long day of sorting through dusty old manuscripts. He focused back on his breathing, but the chemical scent only seemed to grow more intense, taking on a hot and acrid edge that made his eyes water. It was a detail that felt out of sync with the peaceful spring night, a jagged note in an otherwise perfectly smooth scene. He reached out to touch the cool silver of his father's lighter, seeking that small and familiar comfort, but his hand stopped mid-air as a sudden, sharp crackling sound echoed from the alley below. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the trains, but a high-pitched, snapping noise that sounded like a dry branch breaking in a forest fire. In the same heartbeat, the air in the room was suddenly filled with a wave of heat that felt like a physical blow to his face. Now, everything is happening in a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion and sound as your lungs suddenly seize up from the thick black smoke. You hear the deafening roar of a fire that has seemingly appeared out of nowhere, consuming the very paper you had so carefully sorted just hours before. You try to take a deep breath, but the air is a searing liquid that burns your throat, and the world turns into a series of jagged orange streaks that dance. You are an arson investigator, standing in the charred remains of a narrow Shinjuku alley, and you are looking at the thousands of surveillance cameras that line the surrounding buildings. You have watched the footage from the last 12 hours a dozen times, but you see no one entering or leaving the area at the time the first flame appeared. You see only the sudden, violent eruption of fire from a pile of old cardboard, as if a ghost had reached out and struck. You are the investigator. And in this heartbeat, you realize that the perpetrator was never caught on camera because they were never there when the fire started. You find the remains of a small, household chemical device designed to ignite on a delay, allowing the arsonist to be miles away in a crowded subway station when the destruction began. You see the silver lighter of a shopkeeper sitting in the ash, its crane's wings melted into a shapeless lump of metal. The investigation into the series of fires that had terrorized the Nakano and Shinjuku districts for 4 long months would eventually reveal a pattern that pointed to a ghost. Forensic teams spent weeks looking for a suspect who fit the profile of a serial arsonist, but the timed incendiaries made from common household products left behind no fingerprints. The perpetrator was a master of using the city's own waste and its own technology to hide their crimes. The anchor of Haruto's quiet life, the silver-plated pocket lighter that had sat on his bedside table for over 20 years, was found in the wreckage of his apartment. The delicate engraving of the crane had been scorched beyond recognition, a silent witness to the moment that the security of his bookstore was destroyed by a fire that had no face and no name. It was a bitter irony that an object designed to create a flame was destroyed by one he did not start. Haruto was one of the many residents who lost everything in the series of fires. His collection of 1,000 stories turned into a pile of gray ash in a single night. His dream of seeing the northern lights was buried under the weight of the reconstruction costs and the loss of his livelihood, leaving him a ghost in his own neighborhood. The man who had once been a guardian of the city's history now found himself afraid of the very scent of a flickering candle. The arsonist, dubbed the Ghost of Tokyo, was never identified by the police despite the city's dense network of cameras and the efforts of the best investigators in the country. They remained a shadow in the records, a person who understood how to exploit the lag time of a chemical reaction to create a perfect and unbreakable alibi. They vanished back into the crowd of millions, leaving behind only the scars on the streets and the fear in the hearts of men. The case remains a haunting example of how the most advanced surveillance systems in the world can be defeated by a simple and ancient weapon when it is used with modern precision. It serves as a reminder that the eyes of the city are not always enough to protect the innocent from a predator who knows how to walk between the frames of a video feed. The alleys of Shinjuku remain vibrant and bright, but the memory of the ghost continues to linger. The story of the arsonist who never appeared on camera is a grim testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who are never seen at all. It is a haunting fade that provides no closure for the victims, leaving behind only a sense of profound and lingering unease every time the wind carries the scent of smoke. Haruto's bookstore was never rebuilt, and the silence of the Arctic was replaced by the silence of a life lost to the flame. As a narrator, I often reflect on the illusion of safety that we build for ourselves in the heart of the city, and how a single, timed event can shatter that illusion in an instant. We trust the cameras to watch over us and the walls to hold back the dark, but there are those who know how to use our own structures against us. It is a sobering thought that a fire can be started by a person who is currently sitting at home, miles away from the heat and the screams. The reality of solving such a case today is vastly different. Fire departments in major cities now use AI-driven trajectory modeling that can calculate the exact point of origin of a blaze within seconds of the first alarm. These modern systems can also analyze the chemical composition of the smoke in real time to identify the specific components of an incendiary device, leading police to the point of purchase. Today, the Ghost of Tokyo would have been identified by their shopping list. The evolution of threat is a terrifying reality. The dangers we face are no longer just physical predators, but the very waste we leave behind on the curb. While one man was lost to the invisible flames of a Tokyo alley, a group of people in Mexico were about to be turned into a public display of terror that was as visible as it was horrific. They were hung from a bridge in the morning light, a human chandelier that signaled a war of a much different and darker scale. May 4th, 2012, 7:30 in the morning, Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. The air was exceptionally thick with the heavy scent of diesel exhaust and the sweet, dusty smell of the Chihuahuan desert that seemed to coat everything in a layer of fine, brown silt. High above, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter and the low, constant roar of thousands of trucks waiting to cross the border into the state of Texas. The light was a pale, hazy orange that shimmered off the concrete of the highway, making the world look like it was vibrating in the early morning heat. There was a faint, misleading scent of fresh orange blossoms floating on the breeze from a nearby grove, a small detail that felt out of place among the industrial noise of the bridge. Emerging from the silver mist of the river was a man named Javier, a 30-year-old father with a very kind and tired face. Javier had spent the last 10 years working at a large manufacturing plant on the outskirts of the city, a place where the machines never stopped humming and the air was always filled with the smell of hot metal. He was a man of quiet habits and even quieter dreams, a person who found a sense of profound purpose in the simple act of providing for his 3 young children. He moved through the world with a steady and practiced grace that commanded respect. Every single morning at 5 o'clock, Javier would wake up in his small, brightly painted house to the sound of his wife grinding corn for tortillas, a rhythmic and comforting noise that signaled the start of another day. He would sit at the small wooden table, drinking a cup of strong coffee that smelled of cinnamon, and watch his children sleep in the next room. He felt a deep sense of peace in these early hours, a feeling that his hard work was truly worth the effort. He grew up in a tiny mountain village where the only way to earn a living was to labor in the fields under the blistering sun, and he often told his children that education was the only way to escape the cycle of poverty. Javier was a man of immense physical strength but even greater humility, a quality that made him a favorite among his co-workers at the factory. He viewed his job not as a burden, but as a lucky opportunity to build a stable life for his family. His greatest dream, the one he whispered to his wife every night while the city hummed outside their window, was that someday he would buy a small plot of land far away from the border. He wanted a place where he could grow his own vegetables and where his children could play in the grass without ever hearing the sound of a siren or a distant gunshot. He viewed every shift at the plant as a few more meters of soil in that future garden he so often imagined. In the ignition of his old dented sedan, hanging right next to the silver key, was a small and colorful beaded keychain known as an ojo de venado. It featured a large, dark seed surrounded by intricate patterns of red and yellow thread, a traditional charm meant to protect the driver from the evil eye and the dangers of the road. To Javier, that little object was a symbol of his mother's love and the ancient beliefs that grounded him in a very chaotic world. He had carried that keychain with him for over 15 years, moving it from one vehicle to the next as a silent guardian of his journeys through the crowded streets of the city. He would often run his thumb over the smooth surface of the seed when he felt stressed or overwhelmed by the demands of his life, the physical sensation providing a moment of calm. It was a harmless piece of folk art, but in his mind, it provided a sense of absolute and total protection. Javier believed that as long as he stayed away from the dark alleys and the dangerous men who controlled the shadows, he and his family would remain safe from the violence that often spilled into the streets. He followed a strict routine, driving the same route to work every single day and never stopping for anyone he didn't recognize. To him, the main highway was a safe corridor, a predictable path that connected his sanctuary at home to his sanctuary at work. He was a man who understood the specific security illusion of the border, the belief that the presence of the police and the military on the main roads was enough to keep the chaos at bay. He felt that the heavy traffic and the bright morning sun were a form of armor, protecting the thousands of workers who were just trying to earn an honest living. To Javier, Nuevo Laredo was a city of two worlds, and he worked very hard to ensure he never crossed into the other. As he began his commute on that Friday morning, the city of Nuevo Laredo felt like any other bustling metropolis on the verge of a hot weekend. The sidewalks were filled with people walking to the bus stops, the smell of street food beginning to drift through the air as the vendors set up their stalls. Javier felt a surge of incredible optimism as he listened to a popular song on the radio, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat against the leather of the steering wheel. He took a long sip of his coffee from a thermos, the liquid sliding down his throat and providing a momentary distraction from the heat that was already beginning to rise from the asphalt. The car felt stable and reliable beneath him, a faithful machine that had never let him down during his thousands of trips to the manufacturing plant. Javier felt a sense of total mastery over his environment, a feeling of absolute confidence that today was just another routine shift. The bridge ahead was a massive structure of steel and concrete that spanned the highway, a vital artery that carried the lifeblood of the city's commerce and its many thousands of workers. Javier didn't pay much attention to the architecture of the bridge, viewing it as a functional necessity of his daily life. He He assumed that the only things he would see on his commute were the usual line of trucks and the tired faces of other drivers in the morning light. His cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of old upholstery and the faint, sweet scent of a pine-shaped air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The sun beat down on the windshield, creating a pocket of warmth that made him feel safe and isolated from the noise of the world outside. Javier adjusted his side mirror, watching the dust kick up behind his wheels, and felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude for the simple stability of his life. The vibration of the engine was a steady, low-frequency thrum that he felt in the soles of his boots and the small of his back, a sensation that was as familiar as his own heartbeat. The highway was crowded with other vehicles, giving him a sense of communal purpose as everyone moved toward their respective jobs in the industrial zone. The little beaded keychain on the ignition continued its gentle, happy swinging, its colors bright and vibrant in the sun. The air inside the car was still and quiet, save for the music and the hum of the air conditioning, creating an atmosphere of profound safety from the external world. Javier leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a split second to imagine the smile on his daughter's face when he brought home the special treats he had promised for the evening. He felt like a man who was finally in control of his destiny, a feeling of peace that few other people ever found. But then, as he approached the base of the massive bridge where the traffic usually began to thin out, he noticed a very strange and sudden change in the rhythm of the road. Every vehicle ahead of him began to slow down abruptly, their brake lights flashing like a series of warning signals in the hazy morning air. He paused, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs, wondering if there had been a major accident or a police checkpoint at the top of the rise. He dismissed the delay with a quick shake of his head, telling himself that the morning rush was simply more congested than usual and that he would still make it to his shift on time. He focused back on the road, but the silence that began to descend over the highway felt heavy and unnatural, as if the entire city had suddenly stopped breathing. It was a detail that felt out of sync with the busy morning, a jagged note in an otherwise perfectly smooth scene. He reached out to touch the smooth surface of the beaded keychain, seeking that small and familiar comfort, but his hands stopped midair as he looked up at the silhouette of the bridge. It wasn't the usual sight of traffic or construction workers that met his eyes, but something much darker and more disjointed that hung from the steel girders. In the same heartbeat, the air in the car was suddenly filled with a wave of cold that felt like a physical blow. Now, everything is happening in a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion and sound as your heart suddenly hammers against your ribs with a violent intensity. You hear a high-pitched ringing in your ears that grows louder with every passing second, drowning out the sound of the radio and the idling engines. You try to look away, but your eyes are fixed on the shapes swinging in the wind, and the world turns into a series of jagged black streaks that dance. You are sitting in your car in the middle of a crowded highway, and the only sound you can hear is the frantic beating of your own heart and the low, constant hum of the desert wind. You see 9 figures hanging from the bridge, 5 men and 4 women, their bodies silhouetted against the bright orange sun like a gruesome human chandelier. In this heartbeat, you have to decide, do you keep driving through the nightmare, or do you turn your car around? You are the witness, and as you look up at the bridge, you see a large, dark banner hanging next to the victims, its white letters spelling out a message of absolute and total terror. You realize that the peace you thought you had built for your family was nothing more than a fragile mask for a war that has no front lines and no rules. You see the beaded keychain on your ignition, and for the first time in 15 years, you realize that it cannot protect you. The investigation into the massacre at the bridge would eventually reveal that the 9 victims were members of a rival cartel, captured and executed as part of a theater of cruelty. Forensic teams found that the victims had been beaten and blindfolded before being hung, a display designed to dominate the public space and terrorize the civilian population. The Los Zetas cartel claimed responsibility, using the bridge as a canvas for their brutal message of power. The anchor of Javier's life, the colorful beaded keychain that had sat in his ignition for over a decade, was found in his car as he sat paralyzed with fear in the middle of the road. The Ojo de Venado, meant to protect against the evil eye, had watched as the most horrific sight imaginable was placed directly in the path of thousands of innocent people. It was a bitter irony that the charm of protection was present during a moment of total and utter vulnerability. Javier was one of the many residents who was forever changed by the sight on the bridge. The image of the swinging figures burned into his mind like a hot coal that would never cool. His dream of buying a small plot of land far away from the border became a desperate and frantic necessity, a goal that was now fueled by terror rather than hope. The man who had once been a king of his own routine now found himself afraid of the very sight of a highway bridge. The perpetrators of the massacre were never brought to justice, as the city was gripped by a silence that was born from the absolute certainty of what happened to those who spoke out. From a criminological perspective, the bridge hanging was not a crime of passion, but a calculated and surgical strike against the psychological stability of an entire community. The victims remained anonymous in many of the reports, their lives reduced to a number and a location. The case remains a haunting example of how a public space can be turned into a weapon of war when the structures of the state begin to crumble under the weight of organized crime. It serves as a reminder that the lines we draw for our own safety are often much thinner than we like to believe, especially in a world where cruelty is used as a form of communication. The bridge in Nuevo Laredo remains a vital part of the city's infrastructure, but it is a place of ghosts. The story of the human chandelier is a grim testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world are those who want you to see exactly what they are capable of doing. It is a haunting fade that provides no closure for the families of the victims, leaving behind only a sense of profound and lingering unease every time a car approaches a highway span. Javier's children never forgot the look in their father's eyes when he finally came home. As a narrator, I often reflect on the theater of cruelty and how it relies on the presence of innocent witnesses to achieve its dark and twisted goals. We are forced to become part of a story we never wanted to read, and we carry the weight of those images with us for the rest of our lives. It is a sobering thought that a simple bridge, a symbol of connection and progress, can be turned into a monument of absolute and total despair in a single morning. Today's digital age paints a much different picture. International authorities now use real-time satellite narco-terror monitoring to identify the movement of cartel hit squads before they can reach public spaces. These advanced systems use artificial intelligence to detect the specific patterns of suspicious vehicles and the deployment of banners in high-risk zones, allowing for rapid response by military units. Today, the bridge would have been secured long before the sun ever rose. The change in scale is a terrifying reality. The violence we face can grow from a single act of desperation to a massive public display of power that affects thousands of people. While a group of people in Mexico were turned into a human chandelier, a single man in Somalia was about to find out that the price of speaking the truth was a persistent and relentless hunt. He thought the ambulance was his path to safety, but for the assassins, it was just a new target. October 21st, 2012, 7:30 in the evening, Mogadishu, Somalia. The air was exceptionally thick, with the heavy scent of sea salt from the Indian Ocean and the metallic tang of old iron from the crumbling buildings of the district. High above, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of waves against the harbor walls and the low, constant hum of a generator in a nearby alley. The light was a dusty, bruised shade of orange. A man named Mohammed, who was widely known by his colleagues as the Hawk because of his sharp eyes, stepped out from the shadows of a radio station. At 35 years old, he moved with a quiet, confident grace that suggested he understood the weight of the words he spoke every day. He was currently adjusting his dark blazer, a task he performed with a meticulous care that mirrored his dedication to reporting the truth to the thousands of people who listened to him. The radio station where Mohammed spent his days was a cramped and windowless room located in the back of a heavily reinforced concrete building. The air was always filled with the smell of strong black tea and the ozone from the aging electronic equipment that hummed with a low and constant energy. He loved the way the red light above the door glowed when he was on the air, a signal to the rest of the world that, for a few precious minutes, his voice was the only thing that mattered. Mohammed had spent the last 10 years working as an investigative journalist, a role that required an immense amount of courage in a city held in a grip of terror. He never hesitated to report on the activities of the extremist groups that threatened the safety of his neighbors, believing that silence was the greatest ally of the darkness. He was a man who viewed his microphone as a shield, a tool that allowed him to stand between the innocent and those who sought to destroy them. In his breast pocket, right next to his press credentials, he carried a vintage, silver-cased stopwatch that had once belonged to his father. The metal was cool and heavy against his chest, and he used it every day to time his radio segments with a level of precision that was famous among the staff. To Muhammad, that little stopwatch was not just a tool. It was a connection to a family legacy of intellectual resistance and a symbol of the order he brought to a chaotic world. Every single morning before his shift began, Muhammad would sit in a small outdoor cafe near the station, drinking a glass of spiced tea and reading the local papers. He would often wave to the children playing in the dusty street, his pockets always filled with a few small coins that he would give to the ones who looked the hungriest. He was a man who found deep joy in these small, human moments that occurred despite the constant threat of violence that hung over the city. His greatest dream, the one he shared with his wife while they sat on their balcony overlooking the harbor, was that someday he would take his family to a place of peace. He wanted to open a small school for young writers where they could learn the craft of storytelling without the fear of a knock at the door in the middle of the night. He viewed every radio broadcast as a small, necessary payment toward that future, where the only sounds at night were the crickets. Muhammad believed that as long as he stayed within the busy, well-lit areas of the neighborhood and maintained a consistent routine, he would be protected by the community. He felt that the people he served were his invisible shield, a collective of thousands of eyes that would watch over him as he moved from the studio to his home. To him, Mogadishu was a dangerous landscape, but it was also a place where he felt a profound and lasting sense of true belonging. He would often wind the silver watch while he was thinking about a lead, the rhythmic clicking providing a sense of comfort that he could not find anywhere else in his life. It was a constant companion during his long shifts, a small and reliable object that grounded him in the present moment when the news he reported felt overwhelming. He trusted the mechanical heart of the watch to keep his world moving forward, even when the structures of society seemed to be failing. As he walked home, Muhammad counted his steps, a habit he had developed to keep his mind focused on the physical reality of the ground beneath his feet. He knew every crack in the pavement and every turn in the narrow alleys, having navigated this path thousands of times over the last decade. He felt that the city itself was a puzzle that he was slowly solving, one broadcast at a time, until the picture of the truth was finally clear for everyone to see and understand. On the evening of October 21st, Muhammad had just finished a particularly difficult report about the activities of a local hit squad. He felt a sense of total satisfaction as he stepped out of the station, the cool night air hitting his face and carrying the scent of wood smoke and the sea. He reached into his pocket and touched the smooth silver of his father's watch, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and a quiet pride in the work he had just finished. As he began his walk home through the familiar streets, he noticed a young man on a small, battered motorbike parked under a flickering streetlight about a block away. The rider was not moving or looking at his phone. He was simply watching the entrance of the radio station with a level of focus that felt out of sync with the casual atmosphere. Muhammad paused for a second, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs with a sudden and intense wave of anxiety. He quickly dismissed the unease with common sense, telling himself that the city was full of people waiting for rides or simply resting in the shadows to escape the heat. He rationalized that the motorbike was likely just a courier waiting for a delivery, and that his nerves were simply a bit frayed from the intense reporting he had done. He smiled at the rider as he passed, but the man did not move or acknowledge his presence in any way at all, remaining perfectly still. He noticed that the sound of the city seemed to change as he moved deeper into the residential area, the noise of the traffic fading away and leaving a heavy silence. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of his own shoes on the pavement and the distant, muffled voices of families eating dinner behind closed doors. The light from the moon was thin and pale, casting long and jagged shadows that seemed to follow him like a pack of silent and hungry ghosts in the dark. He noticed a small, torn poster flapping against a brick wall, the sound of the paper hitting the stone like a series of soft, rapid heartbeats in the night. It was an advertisement for a concert that had been canceled months ago, a relic of a time when the people still felt comfortable gathering in groups. The sight of the shredded paper made him feel a sudden and overwhelming sense of loss, a realization of how much the war had stolen from the simple joy of the city. Now, the world is beginning to turn into a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion and sound. You hear the sharp, loud crack of a pistol firing from the shadows of a doorway just a few feet ahead of you, followed by a second and a third shot. You feel a sudden, white-hot sting in your chest that feels like a branding iron has been pressed against your skin, and your legs suddenly turn to lead as you collapse onto the dusty ground in the middle of the empty street. You cannot see the shooter. Instead, you see only the flickering light of the street lamp and the dark, wet stain that is beginning to spread across the front of your shirt. You hear the high-pitched ringing in your ears that grows louder with every passing second, drowning out the sound of the motorbike as it speeds away into the darkness. You try to take a deep breath, but the air in your lungs feels like liquid fire, and you can only manage a soft and raspy gasp. When the first bullet struck, the world did not explode in a burst of noise. Instead, the sound was strangely muffled, like a heavy book falling onto a thick carpet. Mohammed watched in slow motion as the silver stopwatch slipped from his fingers and tumbled through the air, the light catching the metal for a brief second. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest that made his lungs feel like they were made of dry sand, refusing to expand or take in the cool air. He felt the rough texture of the dusty ground against his cheek, the stones feeling cold and sharp as if they were trying to push him back up toward the sky. He could see a single, bright star shining through the gap between two tall buildings, a distant and indifferent light that seemed to pulse with a slow and rhythmic energy. The sound of his own breathing was the only thing he could hear, a ragged whistle that filled the empty spaces of the quiet and dark neighborhood. You are a medic standing in the back of a small, battered ambulance that has just arrived at the scene of a shooting in the neighborhood. You see a man lying on the ground, his eyes wide and staring at the sky as he clutches a silver watch in his trembling hand. You have to decide, do you load him into the back and drive as fast as you can to the hospital, or do you wait in the shadows because you see the headlights of a car following you in the dark mirror? You are the witness, and in this heartbeat, you realize that the war has followed this man into the very vehicle meant to save his life. You can hear the sound of another car approaching from behind, its engine roaring with a relentless and predatory intent that makes your blood run cold. You have to make a choice that will define the rest of your existence, while the man on the gurney looks at you with a silent and desperate plea for help that you will never forget. Inside the ambulance, the world was a chaotic blur of swaying shadows and the sharp, clinical scent of antiseptic and old bandages. Mohammed could feel every bump in the road as a wave of intense and white-hot agony that radiated from his chest and out into his fingertips. The medic was leaning over him, his face a mask of frantic concentration in the flickering light of a single overhead bulb that hummed with a low and electrical buzz. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The investigation into the assassination of Mohammed would eventually reveal that he had been targeted by an Al-Shabaab hit squad because of his brave reporting. These squads use spotters on motorbikes to track their targets for weeks, learning their routines and identifying the exact moment when they would be most vulnerable. They did not just want to kill a man, they wanted to send a message of absolute terror to every other journalist who dared to speak the truth. When the forensic teams examined the scene of the shooting, they found the silver case stopwatch lying in the dirt next to a pool of dark blood. The glass face was shattered, and the hands of the watch had stopped at exactly 7:47 in the evening, the precise moment the first bullet had struck Mohammed's chest. The anchor of his daily routine, the object meant to bring order to his world, had become a permanent and silent record of his final second on Earth. The hit squads in Mogadishu were known for their surgical precision and their absolute lack of mercy when it came to those who dared to criticize their extremist ideology. They viewed journalists not as civilians, but as active combatants in an ideological war that spanned the entire globe. By following the ambulance, they were signaling to the entire city that there was no sanctuary for the truth, not even in the hands of those who were sworn to protect and save life. Mohammed surprisingly survived the initial burst of gunfire and was loaded into an ambulance, but the assassins were not finished with their work that night. In a display of macabre and persistent cruelty, the hit squad followed the ambulance through the dark streets, firing at the vehicle to ensure that he did not make it to the hospital. The journalists who worked with him later called 2012 the Black Year for the Somali media, a time of deep mourning. Mohammed Turiyare died on the operating table just a few hours after the attack, leaving behind a wife and several young children who would now have to navigate the war without him. He was one of 18 journalists killed in Somalia during that single year, a statistic that shocked the international community and highlighted the incredible danger. No one was ever arrested for his murder, and the hit squad vanished back into the city shadows like they were never there. His story is a haunting fade into the long and tragic history of a city that has seen far too much violence and far too little justice for those who dare to dream of peace. Muhammad was a man who believed in the power of words, and in the end, he became a symbol of the high price that must be paid for the preservation of the truth in a world governed by fear. He remains a ghost in the hallways of the radio station, a reminder of a voice that was too brave to be quieted. As a narrator, I often think about the survival psychology of those who live in war zones and how the repetition of a routine is a way of reclaiming a sense of humanity from the chaos. We build our lives around small, predictable actions to convince ourselves that we are still in control, even when the world around us is falling apart. It is a sobering thought that the very habits we use to stay sane can be the very things that allow our enemies to find us in the dark. Thanks to modern investigative technology, the city of Mogadishu has begun to implement a sophisticated network of digital surveillance and biometric tracking to identify known insurgents. Modern journalists in high-risk zones now carry emergency beacons that are linked directly to international security teams, allowing for immediate intervention if they are ever targeted. Today, the spotters on motorbikes would be identified by their movement patterns long before they could strike. One man's voice was silenced by a bullet in the dark streets of Somalia, but another man's future was about to be decided by a single, surgical shot through a car window in the heart of Kabul. He was a man of peace who had spent his life trying to bring people together, only to find that in a world of perpetual war, the most dangerous thing you can ever do is to ask everyone to finally put down their weapons and talk. May 13th, 2012, 8 o'clock in the morning. Kabul, Afghanistan. The air was exceptionally thick with the heavy scent of burning charcoal and the sharp, dry smell of mountain dust that seemed to coat every surface in a layer of fine, gray grit. High above, the only sound was the chaotic, rhythmic blaring of car horns and the low, constant roar of a city waking up to a harsh and unforgiving sun that turned the sky a pale, dusty yellow. A slight, unnatural silence seemed to hang over one specific intersection in the Debari district, where the shadows of the tall concrete blast walls stretched across the pavement like long and jagged fingers. There was a faint, misleading scent of jasmine drifting from a hidden garden nearby, a small detail that felt out of place among the exhaust fumes and the industrial noise. Emerging from the silver haze of the morning traffic was a white sedan moving with a steady pace. Inside the car, a man named Arsala Rahmani was currently adjusting his rearview mirror, a task he performed with a meticulous and quiet grace that spoke of a man who valued order above all else. At 68 years old, his face was a map of the many wars he had witnessed. His beard a stark white against his weathered skin, he moved with a slow and practiced ease, his eyes focused on the road ahead as he navigated the sea of vehicles with a sense of calm. Arsala was a man who had spent his life at the very center of his nation's turbulent history, once serving as a high-ranking minister before choosing a much more difficult and dangerous path. He was now a key member of the High Peace Council, a group of elders dedicated to ending the cycle of violence through dialogue rather than bullets. He was a man of immense quiet strength, a person who believed that the power of a soft word could eventually overcome the roar of a cannon. Every single morning before leaving his home, Arsala would sit with his grandchildren, sharing a simple breakfast of warm bread and honey, while he told them stories of a land that existed only in his memory. He was a man who found deep joy in these small domestic moments, believing that the future of his country was reflected in the bright and curious eyes of the children. He felt a profound sense of purpose in his work, viewing it as a sacred and necessary duty. He grew up in a province where the mountains were high and the valleys were deep, and he often spoke of the beauty of the landscape before the decades of conflict had scarred the earth. Arsala was a man of immense intellectual depth, a person who spent his evenings reading poetry and ancient history in the quiet of his study. He viewed the peace process not as a political maneuver, but as a spiritual mission to restore the soul of a people who had forgotten how to rest. His greatest dream, the one he whispered to his fellow council members during their long and difficult meetings, was that someday he would see the children of Kabul playing in the parks without fear. He wanted a world where the only reason a person looked at the sky was to admire the clouds, not to watch for the silver glint of a predator. He viewed every negotiation as a small but vital step toward that distant and beautiful horizon he so desperately wanted to reach. In his right hand, resting on the seat next to him, was a pristine, hand-woven white prayer cap that he wore every time he entered a mosque or a meeting of elders. The fabric was soft and clean, featuring an intricate pattern of geometric shapes that represented the balance and the order he sought to bring to his world. To Arsala, that little white cap was a symbol of his transition from a man of war to a man of peace, a crown of humility and a sign of his faith. He had carried a similar cap with him for over 40 years, a constant companion through the many changes of government and the long winters of exile. He would often run his fingers over the texture of the weaving when he was faced with a particularly difficult decision, the physical sensation providing a sense of continuity and calm. It was a harmless piece of clothing, but in his mind, it provided a sense of spiritual protection and a reminder of his ultimate goal. Arsala believed that as long as he stayed true to his principles of reconciliation and showed respect to all sides of the conflict, he would be protected by the very peace he was trying to build. He felt that his status as an elder and his reputation for honesty were a form of armor that would keep him safe from those who still believed in the power of the gun. To him, the streets of Kabul were a testing ground for his beliefs, a place where he led by a quiet example. He was a man who understood the specific security illusion of a busy intersection, the belief that the presence of hundreds of witnesses and the bright morning light were enough to deter an assassin. He felt that the heavy traffic and the communal energy of the commute were a shield, protecting the thousands of people who were just trying to navigate their lives. To Arsala, the city was a living organism, and he was just one small part of its rhythmic and steady pulse. As he drove toward the council headquarters, the city of Kabul felt like it was on the verge of a significant breakthrough, with rumors of new talks and a temporary ceasefire filling the air. Arsala felt a surge of incredible optimism as he adjusted his radio to a station playing traditional music, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat against the steering wheel. He felt like a man who was finally seeing the first light of dawn after a very long and very dark night of struggle. He took a slow, deep breath of the dusty air, feeling the warmth of the sun on his arm through the open window of his car. The vehicle felt heavy and stable beneath him, a reliable machine that had carried him through many dangerous years without a single mechanical failure. Arsala felt a sense of total mastery over his environment, a feeling of absolute confidence that today was just another routine day in a career that had been defined by its steady and quiet persistence. The intersection ahead was a massive and chaotic swirl of dust and motion, a vital crossing where the lives of thousands of people intersected for a few brief seconds every single morning. Arsala didn't pay much attention to the other drivers, viewing them as fellow travelers on the same difficult journey toward a better future. He assumed that the only thing he would encounter on his commute was the usual delay and the tired but hopeful faces of his neighbors. His cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of old upholstery and the faint, sweet scent of a rosewater air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The sun beat down on the windshield, creating a pocket of warmth that made him feel safe and isolated from the noise of the world outside. Arsala adjusted his prayer cap on the seat, watching the dust motes dance in the light, and felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude for the stability of his current life. The vibration of the engine was a steady, low-frequency thrum that he felt in the soles of his boots and the small of his back, a sensation that was as familiar as his own heartbeat. The road was crowded with other vehicles, giving him a sense of communal purpose as everyone moved toward their respective roles in the rebuilding of the city. The little white prayer cap on the seat remained perfectly still, its intricate patterns sharp and clear in the morning sun. The air inside the car was still and quiet, save for the music and the hum of the city, creating an atmosphere of profound safety from the external world. Arsala leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a split second to imagine the peace treaty he hoped to help draft by the end of the year. He felt like a man who was finally in control of his legacy, a feeling of peace that few other people ever found in a land that had seen so much sorrow and so much war. But then, as his car slowed down to wait for a gap in the merging traffic, he noticed a very strange and sudden change in the rhythm of the vehicles directly next to his window. A dark car pulled up alongside him, moving with a level of precision and silence that felt out of sync with the chaotic energy of the intersection. He paused, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs, wondering if it was a friend or a colleague trying to get his attention in the crowd. He dismissed the unease with a quick shake of his head, telling himself that the morning light was simply playing tricks on his eyes and that he was being overly cautious after a week of intense meetings. He focused back on the road, but the silence that seemed to radiate from the dark car was heavy and unnatural, as if the air itself had suddenly turned to solid lead. It was a detail that felt out of sync with the busy morning, a jagged note in a smooth scene. He reached out to touch the soft fabric of the prayer cap, seeking that small and familiar comfort. But his hand stopped midair as he saw the window of the dark car slide down with a mechanical hiss. It wasn't the face of a friend that met his eyes, but the cold and unblinking barrel of a silenced handgun emerging from the shadows of the interior. In the same heartbeat, the air in the cabin was suddenly filled with a wave of cold that felt like a physical blow. Now, everything is happening in a terrifying and disjointed blur of motion and sound as your heart suddenly hammers against your ribs with a violent intensity. You hear the sharp, muffled puff of a silenced weapon firing from the car just a few inches away from your head, followed by a second and a third shot. You feel a sudden, white-hot sting in your neck that feels like a branding iron has been pressed against your skin, and your vision begins to blur. You are sitting in the car directly behind the white sedan, and you have been watching the traffic move with a bored and distracted focus for the last 10 minutes. You see a dark car pull up next to the old man, and then you see a series of small, rapid flashes of light and the sudden spidering of the driver's side glass. In this heartbeat, you have to decide. Do you jump out of your car to help, or do you step on the gas and try to flee the invisible and silent danger? You are the witness, and as you look through the shattered window, you see the man who once stood for peace slump forward over the steering wheel, his life ending in a single second. You realize that the order you thought you saw in the city was nothing more than a fragile mask for a darkness that can strike anyone at any time. You see the white prayer cap fall from the seat and land in the glass, a final piece of a dream that has been shattered in the sun. The investigation into the assassination of Arsala Rahmani would eventually reveal that he had been targeted by a professional hit squad that used a silencer to ensure they could vanish. Forensic teams found that the shooter had fired with a surgical precision, strike the target in a way that left no room for survival. The attack was a deliberate and calculated blow against the peace process, widely believed to be the work of those who feared a world without war. The anchor of Arsala's life, the pristine white prayer cap that he had carried for 40 years, was found in the footwell of the car, stained with the reality of his final moments. The object meant to represent balance and order had watched as the most chaotic and violent of acts was committed in the middle of a crowded and public intersection. It was a bitter irony that the man who had traded his gun for a cap was destroyed by the very weapon he had abandoned. Arsala was one of the many leaders who was lost to the shadows of Kabul during that dark year, his death marking a significant and tragic setback for the hopes of a nation. The news of his assassination spread through the city like a cold wind, leaving behind a sense of profound and lingering unease among those who believed in the power of dialogue. The man who had once been a warrior died as a martyr for peace, a legacy that would be remembered forever. The perpetrators of the strike were never identified, as they vanished back into the city of millions without leaving a single trace on the thousands of cameras that watched the roads. From a criminological perspective, the assassination was a perfect example of a high-value target being eliminated with a minimal amount of risk and a maximum amount of psychological impact. The white sedan remained at the intersection for hours, a silent monument to a fallen dream. The case remains a haunting example of how a single second of violence can undo decades of patient and dedicated work in the pursuit of a better world for everyone. It serves as a reminder that the path of peace is often the most dangerous road of all, requiring a level of courage that few people truly possess. The intersection in Kabul remains a busy and chaotic place, but for those who remember the morning in May, it will always be a place of a great loss. The story of the peace negotiator is a grim testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can ever do is to ask people to finally put down their weapons and talk. It is a haunting fade that provides no closure for the nation, leaving behind only a sense of profound and lingering sorrow for a voice that was silenced far too early. Arsala's grandchildren never forgot the stories he told them about a land that could finally be safe and beautiful. As we look back at the year 2012, we see a world that was defined by a series of high-stakes transitions and a deep underlying tension that seemed to affect everyone. From the streets of Athens to the mountains of Afghanistan, the stories we have shared today are a reminder of the fragile nature of our security and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. We are all connected by the same desire for safety and the same fear of the dark. The landscape of criminal tracking has transformed entirely. Today, major cities like Kabul are beginning to use modern acoustic gunshot triangulation systems that can identify the exact location of a silenced weapon. These advanced sensors use high-frequency microphones to detect the subtle disturbances in the air caused by a projectile, allowing for an immediate military response to a surgical strike. Today, the car that pulled alongside our Sala would have been tracked by a drone within minutes. As the rain continues to fall against the black screen and the world outside sinks into the deep silence of the night, we take a moment to reflect on the 13 lives we have explored today. Each story was a unique journey through the weird, the dark, and the mysterious. A collection of moments where the ordinary world was suddenly and irrevocably changed by the unexpected. We carry these ghosts with us, not as a burden, but as a lesson in the value of every second. We want to thank you for spending your time with us today, listening to these accounts of the year 2012 and the people who lived through its many shadows. Your support allows us to continue to share these important stories and to keep the memory of the victims alive in a world that often moves too fast to notice the details. We hope that these narratives have provided you with a sense of perspective and perhaps a moment of quiet reflection. The stories of the Scream mask robber, the poisoned runner, the ritualistic butcher, and the silent negotiator are all threads in a larger tapestry of human experience that we are still weaving. They remind us that even in the most desperate of times, there is a capacity for love, courage, and a relentless pursuit of the truth that cannot be extinguished by the dark. We are the witnesses to these events, and through our listening, we ensure that they are never truly forgotten. As you drift off into a deep and peaceful sleep, surrounded by the soothing sound of the rain and the warmth of your own home, remember that you are part of a community of listeners. We are all seeking to understand the mysteries of our world and to find a sense of connection in the stories we share with one another in the dark. Take comfort in the fact that even the most terrifying of tales can lead us toward a greater appreciation for the light in our own lives. Until next time, we will be here to guide you through the next set of case files and the next set of mysteries that are waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of our history. We will continue to explore the depths of human psychology and the incredible twists of fate that define our collective journey through the weird and the dark. May your dreams be peaceful and your heart be light as you rest after the long and difficult journey we have taken together.